Yeah, so I've lived in San Francisco for about 40 years, and yes, I've absolutely seen the gentrification. In fact, I could probably be seen as one of the early waves of gentrification because when I came here, I was an Apple technical consultant, primarily in publishing, design, and architecture. So um, I was making enormous sums of money in the 90s, like ridiculous amounts of money. And at the time, I was publishing an art and literary journal called Cyanosis. So almost all of my friends were artists, writers, actors, musicians. And they definitely saw me, you know, they knew what I was doing for a living. So they saw me even back then as, kind of the first wave of tech influx in a way.
Well, I remember in the 90s, Salon magazine started there. And there was, it was actually kind of a bohemian wave of online things happening, which was not objectable, objectionable at all. There was, I mean, San Francisco was once again a hub of something happening of alternative culture. But then the evolution of that is always, you know, first the artists move in, and of course, this is the story of gentrification. In the 90s, I had a conversation. Andre Kujescu wrote a blurb for a book I collaborated on in a dinner in New Orleans. He made the comment that the art movements have a commonality of how they exist. And at the time, Seattle was going on. So, from Seattle to Paris, cheap rent. And then without cheap rent, then you can't have a bohemian alternative to the dominant culture. Because I mean, and I've seen that happen in Austin, which is the sister city of San Francisco, as you probably know, that the cross pollination of music was extraordinary,
Mm.
exquisite. And then, now Austin is being invaded by the same tech bros, and the rents are going sky high. So that is gone now too. Um,
Yeah, nearly zero of my original cohort still lives here. The last time I had
mhm.
any significant interaction with a bohemian or artistic cohort is probably more than 25 years ago, right?
Yeah,
There's nothing. Now, I'm not saying there's none of it here. I'm much older now. I don't really have access to it in a variety of ways, but yeah, the weird thing, one of the weird features of colonization is that it recolonizes itself, right? It's like a recursive process. And it's always if we're looking through this lens, right, then we see consistently sort of new mutations. And the colonization goes from sort of external to internal in the way that perhaps social media
yeah,
represents.
yeah,
And then
yeah.
and
The
then
internal localization is the thing I've written about. Is I mean, you have to adapt to necessity. In the Greek goddess necessity, who's the root word of angst and anxiety. The archetypal psychologist traced her name, James Hillman traced her name to what you put around an oxen to control it, the choke on a slave or an ox. And she has no temples that you can bring offerings to because you have to get up, you have to find something to eat, you have to relieve your paddle and bladder and bowels. You have to find a roof over your head. There are things you have to do for necessity. So there's no reason to give an offering. Your offering is just going through daily life. And when necessity um, gets harder and harder and harder, we have anxiety. And then and then one of the ways with anxiety we react to it is we become manic. And I don't know if I watched this happen in New York, which is always been hermetic in this way, hermetic in the good sense of this cross pollination, this alchemy of art and music and creativity. But then Hermes got to his trickster side as far as becoming a fleece artist, becoming a grifter. In ancient Greece and Athens, they were put right outside of the outskirts of the polis, and there were giant, enormous statues of penises, that warned the public. It was a type of male eros, so there was that symbolism. But there was also, dickheads are over here and they're going to take your money. That's how they dealt with their tech bros. Um, So I watched in New York, which always had a balance between immigrants coming in and immigrants, exiles from the rest of America too, that had something to say, could find cheap rents, find an affinity with other people. There was a time you could walk down the street in the East Village and just get into the most extraordinary conversations on stoops. You would just meet somebody who was never going to be famous, but they should have been. Bands that were as good as any band that ever made it, playing out every night. And so, and there's an effect that has on an individual too, to challenge yourself, to take your art a little bit further. And then there's which I've seen something you write about. There's the effect on the soul, because obviously something happened to you. There must have been something with Jeffrey Kripal, at Rice University, who
Rice.
has his archives of the impossible, calls the flip.
Yeah.
There must have been a flip that happened in your psyche that caused you to go from the life you were living to what I'm looking for the word for it, but what fills your heart now.
Mm. Yeah, there certainly was. And before it's funny, I'm getting kind of choked up just listening to you. I'm not sure that's funny, but it's important. Um, you know, San Francisco was my first taste of a real bohemian culture, although I had gotten sort of previous samples from aspects of the culture in Santa Rosa where I was living just prior to here. There were a few little pockets of artists and musicians, actors and writers and so forth. And I remember uh, in the '90s, the two of the children of Ted Berrigan and Alice Notley came here, Anselm Berrigan and Ed Berrigan, and they were quite young at the time. I think Ed was probably 17, 18, and Anselm was maybe like 22. And they were part of the sort of the little cohort we had here for a while. And I remember hearing noises such as, well, San Francisco is sort of like training wheels for actual artistic life. You really, if you're gonna make it, if you're gonna do this, you got to go to New York, right? Which is of course where they were from. Um, and they're both absolutely brilliant. Uh, I remember their presence here and meeting their mother and going to some readings of hers and hearing recordings of Ted and stuff back in the '90s that were profoundly influential on me. And there were waves of tech colonization, and I was certainly part of the early wave set. But I watched, for example, like Haight Ashbury just become completely gentrified. It was a fairly significant cultural womb, if you will. Uh, and when I was younger, in my late teens, when I started messing around with computers, I was primarily interested in three things: writing, um, strangely artificial intelligence, and music. Right. So I was fascinated by the capacities of computers to become an interface to electronic instruments and so forth. And I thought, I was reading Alan Kurzweil and stuff back then, and perhaps some Gödel, Escher, Bach by Hofstadter, and I remember I was only really fascinated with AI. I was fascinated with AI because I wanted an experience. This actually leads into where you were going a moment ago. I wanted an experience of relating with something that I could fully trust was actually intelligent, and it seemed that very few of the humans, and certainly not our cultures, resembled this virtue of insightful living intelligence. And I thought that perhaps it would be possible to compose such an intelligence mechanically. I thought that for about 8 months. And then I realized that what cells were doing, just the basic, what they, this is a dumb phrase, the building blocks, which is insane, of organisms, was so much more profound than anything machines would ever possibly approach that 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 it never my branch of that branch of interest didn't die out, but my idea that, oh, we're going to make something intelligent inside a machine definitely, mostly faded away.
This was the '90s when a time people thought that they were gonna make money by delivery coffee at home, right? There was a
Right.
there was a lot of grandiosity. I remember standing in a bookstore in Atlanta, Georgia, and looking over at a Wired magazine, and it was talking about the economy is never gonna crash again. It's gonna go up and up and up and up. And I'm thinking, these people are drinking way too much espresso.
Yeah, yeah.
They're staying up all night. They're not getting any sleep. This is a kind of what they call in Jungian psychology puer grandiosity, the winged youth that flies up until his waxen wings are undone by the sun.
Yeah, yeah,
And
the Icarus syndrome.
the Icarus syndrome, which is which infects capitalism.
It does.
There's the aspect of what they call in Jungian psychology the synax, the old man of order, limits, time, money, agriculture. He plants the seeds. His eros is over as far as sexuality, but he plants seeds in the ground and they grow that way. And that can include money. But the flip side, Jung said it's a split off archetype. One side is the old man of order, limits of time. The other is the youth, which is necessary too, of having no limits.
Mhm.
And it seems to me that, this is a puer culture in a way that we don't have a tomorrow. We have a futurity, but we don't actually plan for it. The puer thinks he's so special and unique, the future is going to unfold and take care of itself. You can see this with Elon Musk. You can see he wants to break the bonds of the earth. He wants to fly off to Mars and become its sperminator. Rather than being here on Earth, and having some way that we actually work, like you said, the cell of what it is, the earth, this complex degree of cells that are interrelated, like our body is interrelated, and we don't seem to be able to get to that place where we realize that there is an interconnection not only with the earth but with all things, where inspiration comes from. The Greeks believed there was a daemon. And if you couldn't look at a god directly, like Dionysus's mom, you turn to a pile of ash. So every person had a daemon that connected him with larger orders. And we don't have a way to find ourselves in that because of this hyper individuality, that brings on a kind of what I call crackpot realism. There is an idea that, okay, show me how we can make the future right now by making lots of money. And, of course, in America, where you can come and reinvent your own identity, right? In Britain, you were who your family was. Here, you could just make it up as you go along. And that's good. That's what an artist does. They create a unique identity. But the other side of that is the grifting aspect of that culture, where you can just make it up as you go along, becomes very tempting. And, and,
Yeah, I recently quipped that it's become a "what can't you stop me from doing"
and
ocracy.
which
Right?
is actually interesting. There was a lot of, you were talking about the '60s. There were a lot of yippies that were doing that, but they were
Yeah,
living artistically. There was an idea of we're going to take out. They probably grew up on Mad Magazine, as you know, and they said we're going to live by it. We're going to live by Mad Magazine and later, National Lampoon, and we're going to go out and we're going to live life as art. Um, and then, of course, if you do it successfully, you get commodified, and that
right.
commodification becomes an addiction because I must be doing something right. And so when you get money, you are very unstoppable the more money you get. There
Sure.
seems to be less and less consequences for you the more you go along. So you lose that connection of how things are done down here among us shabby people.
It's funny, so I'm there's like, I have a million questions, and I have no idea. We can just have a conversation, ask each other questions, whatever's comfortable, right? But, I'm a non-formally educated person, so I've never even been to high school. Um, and when I was a kid, my primary teachers were science fiction authors. I've read thousands of science fiction stories, and those were the mothers and fathers of my mind, primarily.
Okay.
But I remember literally at 16, I was something of a master book thief, right? I was a runaway. I was living on the street, and I basically just decided that, since society wasn't giving me anything really at all, then books were free for me. And I remember literally, shoplifting Abby Hoffman's "Steal This Book," right? I don't know if it's
Obvious as it was.
yeah, right. So, yeah, I was something of a child of the '60s. I mean, I was born in '63, and, you probably saw more deeply into it than I did. Um, but even, when I ran away, I went to a place called the Russian River, and this was probably circa '84, I'd guess. No, it was probably even pre-'80 or early '80s, '81, '82. And what was going on there was sort of a leftover bubble of '60s culture. So it was really like a time machine. Back then, my mother was, managing this big Victorian hotel called the Highlandale, and it was just like the 1960s every day. They had a huge bar, big dance floor, bands playing, a kitchen, and all this stuff, and it was just hippies, rednecks. I mean, the primary cohorts were hippies, rednecks, and gay people, right? Which
Mhm.
don't necessarily get along all that well. The
And
hippies
and
and
there
the
were
gay
punkers
people
too, which was just more brittle form of bohemia, but still kind of hippie. You know?
yeah, yeah,
Really, the hippies weren't quite as angry. That the punks were more like yippies, except with a lot more of what they call the time attitude. I remember being in punk clubs, and I remember there was a shift from like, let's say, the cute hippie girl that would come up, reeking of patchouli and be open to talking about, her horoscope, to girls that would slam into you. And I asked my friend, I said, why do they keep, they said, well, they must think you're cute or something. Because so there was a different form of communication, but there was still a viable bohemian because they were squatting in the post-industrial ruins of America and
right,
in various places. And they were living for something resembling art, even if they weren't artistic. People were trying to live artistically. And see, my way into the 60s was I do remember it. I got most of it from television, right? And they got everything wrong. But when I got to be 13 or 14 in Atlanta, there was an underground newspaper called the Great Speckled Bird. It was the equivalent of the Berkeley Barb or the Detroit Free Press. And, I went and hung out and I could sell the papers on the street and dealt with that street life there that was going on. But this is interesting because you were talking about one of the way colonization happens. There is this form of it. The mayor of Atlanta at the time, he was a Jewish man, but he was really overdoing the Southern thing. And he'd come and go, "Hi, I'm Sam Marcel." And there had been Jewish people in Atlanta since, since the early colonists here. But he sent into a 6 block area, he sent 200 cops. And these policemen's job was to destroy hippiedom, to arrest anybody selling weed. And I didn't know at the time, but later in the Church Commission and when CONTELPRO came out, it was full of FBI agents, they were full of CIA operatives, and they were bringing in bikers and they were bringing in people dealing speed and
mm,
heroin to destroy the
mhm,
neighborhood as they were busting the people for acid and grass and busting the hippie communes. So there was that form of CONTELPRO colonization happen. And now, just like now, if you go to Midtown Atlanta, which was called the Strip in those days because it was full of Victorian houses across from Piedmont Park, which would be the Atlanta equivalent of the districts in San Francisco and New York, where these hippie communes and hippie crash pads were. You go there, it's hyper gentrified, unrecognizable, as most of Atlanta was. But still in the 80s, Atlanta, there was a viable bohemian culture, which produced bands like REM, even though they were up the road in Athens, and the Black Crows and the Georgia Satellites. At any given time, there were really good bands, some good enough to be famous, unlike those that were happening the same time as what was happening as I was, and then I started doing like spoken word and music tours around, 48 states every 6 months with a collaborator. And then we go through New York and go through San Francisco and Austin and Boston and, those areas. But I could see that happening Austin still had a vestige of that San Francisco music vibe.
Mhm.
Um, Atlanta did. Small places like Charlotte did.
Yeah.
Asheville, other places all around still had it. But since I lived in Germany and have come back to the States recently for a while, I've noticed that's almost completely gone because of the high rents.
Mhm.
And, that's why I say we have this mania of Hermes, which in his positive side, he is the crossroads. I could go into the many synchronicity experiences, which is Hermes' domain, that made me who I am by by going out these crossroads experience where the mentor or what you needed at that moment just showed up. I'm not sure what the alchemy is that creates that, but it is there in existence. And there seems to be a way with high rents that's less likely to happen, or maybe it happens with people who make far more, much more money than I do, and it's happening there in this aspect of the hermetic.
Yeah, it's brilliant. This correspondence between the upswing in the difficulty of just covering one's survival expenses and so on, and the loss of creative, artistic, bohemian, insightful traditions is quite profound, right? That's not an imaginary link.
Oh
That's a
no,
concrete problem, right?
it is concrete, but it's also shamanistic. Is
Say more about that.
the shaman really just doesn't give a fuck, right? He went mad in his youth, and they said we can't do anything with this kid, and they gave him to the shaman. And he walked between worlds because this one was like the old gospel song, this world is not my home, just passing through. And so he learned to pass through, and there is that kind of connection at the crossroads that would happen when people happen into a thriving bohemian culture. And part of that is the ability, as you have to be allowed to fail over and over again, to feel free enough. I mean, I imagine there are personalities that can keep failing and keep going. But most time, I remember hearing the anecdote that Bob Dylan promised his parents if he hadn't made it across, made headway in a year, he'd come home to Minnesota and work in the family hardware business. And I think, and so in those days, you could come and be accepted, and there was a way that you could be nurtured by mentors who also had cheap rent or places they could have you crash. And now, when I lived in New York before my wife and I left and lived in Munich, everybody in our building was young, going to NYU, going to Parsons, but every one of them was a trustafarian. Every one of them's parents were taking care of the enormous high rents.
Mhm.
And there is a certain self-absorption that comes with that I noticed, that there was an inability to whatever that was, that from the desert comes Jackson Pollock, and he can piss on his patron Peggy Guggenheim's fireplace, right? And he still can do that. Otherwise, he's very nice. They were all very nice, but they weren't going to create splatter art and change art history because everything was too comfortable for them. There was not that interplay between having to live and be reborn into this world. They could still live in their very nice bushy world at the same time. There almost has to be a way where you keep your identity and you write about that. You still keep that, and there is the daemon in there, but there is a way that you say, okay, I'm leaving that and I'm open to rebirth. And
Mm,
it's a process of soul making. And I think when in our culture, when you have the spirit of money, and it is a spirit,
mhm,
and soul making can come by way. I'm not saying that money is the root of all evil. It is going to exist. There's going to be an exchange of somehow. There's going to be this exchange of money, but the way we regard it seems in this culture where it is the only option towards freedom.
mhm,
There is the freedom that you can have that comes from being totally freed by your art as you find a way. Like, okay, for example, one way I could be a poet is I learned to read tarot cards. On Sixth Street in Austin, Texas, we were busking on the streets, trying out new material and making a dollar or two to get a pizza, a slice of pizza. And there was and this transvestite tarot reader said, "I have to go pee. Can you watch my cards?" And reading Jungian psychology as I had, people came up and I just started playing with the cards, and people were handing me money, and that made more than that night than busking by doing that. So I as I said, I studied that art, and I could always go into a cafe and lay down some cards and then make money doing that and not have to worry about my security, and
Mhm.
hence be free to be able to write and not, I have 3 close friends, and we were all told in high school, "Go into advertising," you know? And I tried it for a while, but I would find myself weeping, across the side of the buildings after those 3 martini lunches, There would be just something was askew about, and later, after much analysis, it was like I'm taking the archetypes that come from eternity and I'm applying them to hemorrhoid cures. It's like somehow I found my way to the asshole of creation, and
Yeah.
that's what this is about, right? So there was a spiritual crisis, and I was going to ask you about that because you must have had something similar come about in your life. As I mentioned, Jeffrey Kripal's flip that comes about, and then somewhere emanations from somewhere else arrive that work as guides.
Yeah. So much there. So, you know, I began writing poetry when I was 18, and it actually began with a very specific event, which was me and my sidekick in Stockton at my apartment. My friend Rich Verone and one of his friends who I hadn't met dropped acid in Santa Rosa, had no idea how to get to my house, and just drove directly to my house, on LSD. And I noticed when they got there, we had, they gave us some LSD, and we had quite an adventure that night. But I noticed that they both had notebooks. And I was a voracious reader my whole young life. And I looked in their notebooks, and there was some journalistic stuff and some creative stuff and whatever. And that's the night when I first wrote something in a notebook, and then I just kept doing that. And I wrote hundreds of absolutely abysmally bad, you know, um, sort of like looking at myself in a really bad mirror, and just hundreds of bad poems. And eventually one day, that flipped around, and I finally began to be capable of writing something resembling an actual poem. And I remember what that day was, but that process graduated into a much more experimental relationship with language, and I was hyperlexic as a kid. Um, yeah, there's some apocryphal stories about that I'll skip. So, I met this guy, Gary. He introduced me to some crazy people. I'd heard Laurie Anderson, and there's this album with her and John Giorno, and I heard this craziness coming out of John Giorno that my friend was very interested in, and I was reading Burroughs and stuff. And we began to experiment with language. I became interested in psycholinguistics. And as part of that experiment, I took a job writing ad copy, right? Same thing, like go into advertising, right? Um, there's that film like How to Get Ahead in Advertising, where the guy I think actually grows a second head or something. In any case,
Oh, yeah, the pimple that becomes the head. Yes.
exactly, yeah. And I saw that experience as one which I've done many times in my life, of going to the enemy terrain to understand how that shit works, right? How
Yeah.
people can be influenced with language. But it led to some very wild experiments with language, and I quickly had direct experiences where things that Burroughs speaks of, and I'm not a huge fan of Burroughs's sort of characteristic way of being a writer. He's kind of an alien on
Mhm.
Earth, right? But I learned so much from him. He's certainly one of my finest mentors, especially when he describes producing experimental situations in which to understand something, see something new about the universe and whatever. And so, yeah, I began to have experiences where things I wrote about, I wouldn't say there was mere synchronicity, it was as if some of the things I was writing about occasionally generated futures. And that
Mm.
made me very suspicious in a fundamental way about what the fuck is going on around here. Because
Well, I
if you can
imagine
do
during your science fiction days, you'd read Philip K. Dick too, and that
yeah,
was an influence because that's what immediately popped to mind. Burroughs by way of Philip K. Dick.
mhm,
Okay,
you're on the right track.
yeah.
So, I'm happy to talk about this a little further, but to be very, simplistic about it, I had these 2 experiences. So I had a couple experiences where things I wrote almost literally came true. Complex things where there's like 5 or 6 elements in the narrative, and these things come true, like, with the right name and the right location and stuff. Not a whole bunch of those experiences, but enough to let me know, like, something weird's going on here. And I looked into the some of the history of the surrealists who were also my mentors, particularly the women, people like, Remedios Varo and Leonora Carrington and,
Mm.
Dorothea Tanning and so forth. In any case, I had this adventure that began around 2000, and the first time I was just gripped by this incredible inspiration that I've never seen anything like, and I sat down and I wrote 150 pages of text in about 2 hours, which I'd never done anything like that in my life, right? And I saved the document and I upgraded my operating system. During the upgrade, it crashed. I got the thing back together. I'm a Mac tech, right? This is my game.
Right. Okay.
The document's gone. Everything else is fine. That document is gone, and I can't recreate it. The inspiration that gripped me disappeared. And in the document, I was exploring the foundations of the problem, sort of with humans and language and conceptual thought. And I felt that I had finally a window on it. I could see its origins. I could see what we could do about it. I could see like a whole way of fixing this problem. So that was obliterated. And then in 2002 in May, the same kind of inspiration gripped me. And I began writing a document called Symbols and Sanity that was relatively similar to the first one. And somehow during that process, early on in it, maybe about 45 minutes in, um, there was sort of three things that happened in the sequence. And I'll stop very shortly here. So the first was I began to conceive of human minds as a world just like ours, but that we can't see. So an environment, right? And I called that environment the cognitium. And then it was immediately apparent to me that there were organism like features in that environment that inhabited it. And I called these thrisps. They're very domineering. They're much more Darwinian than organisms are. They basically just go for domination of the transports, terrain, reproductive rights, mutation ability, and so forth. And these could be, thought of as memes in a way, but what I was seeing was more like a complex animal uh, entity. And then when I went into my imagination to invent a word for the connections in the network, I called the network the cognitium. And when I went to invent a word for that, something happened that was absolutely world changing for me, which was there was a light in my mind in a place that I've never knew existed. And the moment I became aware of that light, it began to teach me impossible things. That relationship went on for 9 months, and it was like having the soul of the logos itself with me at all times, teaching me all day long. So that was the fundamental transformational experience that completely, death and rebirth rewrote my awareness of what everything is, obliterated my existing human ontology, replaced it with stuff that's not from humans.
Yeah, well, I mean, Jacques Vallée, we call it high strangeness, or Diane Pasulka, who writes about those experiences and connects them with UFOs, or Jeffrey Kripal. It's classic. I mean, it started, I think, with the poetry and maybe the LSD that, and of course that's an experience where when you're young like that, you write bad poetry until the figure goes, this is so awful, I'm gonna come to help. Some muse, some entity, some daemon, something comes to be an assistant to this kid that's really trying hard. And there's, I kind of look at the figures, and like you said, Ram Dass said, just because you're in touch with a disembodied being, it doesn't mean it's intelligent. So you kind of have to be careful about who you let in the house. Like some of them you said are very domineering. It
Huh?
reminded me what flashed in my mind as you were doing that is some of those entities that come about when people describing DMT trips. Like
Mhm.
you're looking down into the DNA of how the psyche, personal and collective, looks. And we're trying to find an interpretation for something that can't be interpreted. I wrote a very short poem. I don't know if you read it. I put it on Facebook and I haven't sent it anywhere else, but just, a tick sensibility about how, there are certain ways that there's certain chemical reactions that tick smells on skin or fur that makes it doesn't even know it's in these brambles. It doesn't even know it's on a twig, but it just sort of finds its way. You could call it the pollen path with a bee. You could just sort of call it a way of destiny with human onto the blood. This is where it needs to go, but it has no awareness of what sky is. And, we
Right.
live in a brambles the same way. We don't really know, to use Huxley's notion, we filter down. Huxley, by way of William James, we winnow down so much so we can live day to day. We're not all of a sudden getting this florid DMT imagery coming in. We just so we can put one foot in front of the other during the day and make our way through those experiences like you're talking about happen in a way when we can handle them or we'll go mad. And it just lets enough in because we'd be like that tick that all of a sudden that would have no reference to the sky, wouldn't even know what we're looking at. So we're always walking through this architecture of heaven, almost, to put it that way.
Mhm.
It is always here, but we are seeing it in a particular way that describes our humanness. A fly can be coming through a room where Mozart is playing. It means nothing to it. There's a pile of poop over there. That's meaningful. So all the time we are kind of standing on music. There is this, to me, sometimes it feels like, a major chord. Sometimes it feels like a minor chord. At best, they're putting them together in a way that we are coming in existence and we're having what Kerouac called the downbeat. We're being beaten down till we rise as a beat and we're beatified. And so, what you're describing is to me, I'm hearing a beatification. That's why I mentioned Diane Pasulka.
Mhm.
There is an aspect of where you all of a sudden your life was going to completely take a different course because essentially you're a different person after that. You still have a vestige. I mean, I am still the person that I was before these experiences. Well, I just put them in a more mundane sense, even though to call it poetic is not mundane. They were a place where I was imbued with a poetic vision of seeing things that made life more resonant. It made a way of living every day tolerable because it made the mundane have a language where it spoke to me. And it spoke of things both deeper and larger than me that I could only get in an evocative sense, but it was reassuring to know that was happening.
So there's a lot to talk about here, and I'm not sure exactly which star to focus the macroscope on. But
How about your lodestar?
fair enough. You know, I think you and I are both uniquely and perhaps differently aware that most of what we are isn't human. That our
Is it?
humanity is not human. Yeah. I mean, even
No.
if we were to be very simplistic and non-metaphysical about it, first we are beings, then we are beings in this solar system, then we are organisms, then we are animals, then we are humans, then we are particular sorts of humans maybe, right? So even if we just take those concentric circles, it should be clear that most of us isn't human. We are beings, right? We are, beings from this part of the universe. We are, as I said. So I think that, I remember Theodore Sturgeon's book, More Than Human, and certainly I'd read Valis, by Dick, Fast Active Living Intelligence System. Um, Whatever it was that happened to me, and I'm not it's not important to me to ontologically, label, "Oh, it was a this," right?
I don't think we'd have the words for it.
No,
Some
we
of these
certainly
beings you
wouldn't.
refer to might have a language that we
They
couldn't even
do.
understand.
Yeah, essentially one of the things so it was like being in school all day, basically. It was an
Right.
educational thing. And it's kind of like being in a school like a preschool for angels or something like this is one way I could describe it. But it introduced me directly to the non-human aspects of being human, and I've never recovered. Also, similarly to something you said, it warned thankfully I've never recovered, but it warned me that something similar to it could arise in my future experience, and that I should be extremely careful if that happened, and have do some discernment and make some checks, because essentially it implied that, just like humans, right? The fact that actually it used a trope. It was like your friend Joe comes to the door every day. You know him, you know his face, you know his voice. One day he knocks on your door. You look outside. It's Joe. You open the door. How do you know it's Joe? Right? You think you know it's Joe, but what if this day it's not Joe? How would you know? Right? So it basically trained me in all kinds of things. But what I'm trying to get at is, we do have stories from the ancients, and I strongly suspect that human beings were, for most of our history, we had companion intelligences.
Oh,
We
yeah.
might have even, those might have been necessary to our humanity.
I think they still are, and that's one reason we're in such a wasteland.
We agree. Yeah. Now, I'm not trying to, propose a religion or whatever, but I think it's very clear to me from what I was shown and what I've experienced directly that we are like bees on a world without flowers, or rather the reverse. We are like flowers, but there are no bees. And we were made for interaction with these kinds of intelligences that are not necessarily material. There's probably a broad array of them. I've heard John Vervaeke talk about encountering Hermes recently.
Mhm.
Wildly different from what happened to me, because the thing that was with me never spoke in language. It just reforged my awareness directly, as if it had composed my mind, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the real key in Angel. Each angel is terrifying because it serenely disdains to annihilate you. So there, that's the annihilation period. But I mean, like what you're saying is, yeah, there was a lexicon for this. I mean, I've heard people, James Hillman, talk on the subject when a Greek walked through the polis in classical Greece. There was Athena with them. If
Mhm.
they looked seaward, they saw a particular terrifying god with a triton, right? There was, there were, there was a vote between in Athens about who was going to be the patron, whether it was going to be Athena or the aforementioned scary sea. And one vote put Athena there. But see, if you walk through there, you would actually be with the goddess of the polis, and would inform you of how to be in this space. Not that this was utopia. We went through all the anguish and joy that we do as human beings. It's what I just mentioned before. I think there would be a greater resonance to it. And so
Yeah.
these archetypal forms that we're talking about, some have a language, some don't. And this is the structure of an unseen world, like I quoted in a piece I put out this morning. Um, Auden saying we're lived by powers we only pretend to understand.
Mm.
And so these powers that live through us, um, they speak to us. I remember when sometimes when I would be writing a short story with different characters or a play, I'd be in the grocery store and sometimes my hands would be reaching for food. And I'm going, why is that in my cart? I don't eat that. Oh, she does. That's what, the character that you're creating, that is the food that. So there is a way, so that gives you emanations that there is, some binding intelligence, and, you can just look at Bell's theorem, and then later aspects proof. Um, Even location is not what we think it is.
Mhm.
In quantum physics, they pretty much said that location's an illusion, it's relative like time.
Yeah.
So in these spaces beyond, these spaces, that we in the human space, I think it's important to live a human life. A lot of people that get this message, like you were mentioned, Burr, as some kind of alien insectoid intelligence, which I think was, really captured by David Cronenberg
Mm.
in the movie he did with these alien insect intelligence that took him over, that he was spent his early life trying to kill, being, but there was an aspect of that, of where, how am I going to receive this and still remain human? And I think that's the poetry, is the bridge.
Mm.
How am I going to bring this, like, as I mentioned Rilke, where he talks about in his early poem, The Man Watching, where he's talking about, the poem starts with an image of a great storm blowing in, and it's moving the trees and transforming the landscape so it looks to him like a line in a psalm book. And then he says, "What we fight for is so tiny, what fights against us so great. If only we would allow ourselves to be moved as things do by some great storm, then we would grow strong too and not need names." And then what he
Ah.
says is crucial is, for when we win, it's with small things, and the victory itself keeps us small. What is extraordinary does not want to be moved and bent by us. And then he compares, the poet to, a musical instrument being played by an Old Testament angel.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, this is what's going on. This is
yeah,
what's obvious in your work. This is part of why we're having this conversation, right? You are you are a bard in the archaic sense, right? And your passionate awareness of the beauty and the potential of nature, the organisms, the biosphere, the possibilities of intelligent human communality and all of this. You sing so beautifully and constantly and passionately of this. It's a fingerprint I recognize, right? It's a fingerprint that's related to the origins of virtue, justice, music.
mhm.
Not justice as in vengeance,
Oh, yeah,
justice is in beauty.
yeah, yeah. Truth is
Justice is
beauty.
it
Yeah, yes.
as in the fulfillment of the most uh desirable aspects of being in relation, in speech, in the world of humans.
Yeah,
You are a star, my friend. I've
yeah.
watched you shine.
Well, I had 5 cancellations today because of the recent piece I wrote on the heart, about why the left fails, because they think they're gonna win an argument through logic when, they should be brandishing poetry. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah,
and
or at least, at the very least, profoundly compelling rhetorical figures, right?
well, I mean, I give my, I made an illusion before of, like, going and hanging out at the Great Speckled Bird underground newspaper, and they took me to the Byron Pop Festival, which was Woodstock South, and that was my first introduction to LSD. Jimi Hendrix, on his last tour of the United States, played, and I remember watching it from above, but the more profound thing happened during the time after that, where Piedmont Park was the hub of hippiedom, as it was in Haight-Ashbury. There was an aspect of, you would have beings in the park. Well, you had sort of these beings in the park that I'd have to leave my neighborhood and go through this really tough, at the time. Now it's hyper gentrified, but working class neighborhoods where the guys would be working on their cars with Marlboro Reds rolled up in their sleeves and their hair full of Royal Crown, and they chased us into the park. They were going to kick our ass and give us a haircut. And but when they went in there, they encountered something. They were, first of all, beautiful women. There were all these hippie nixies and, gypsy queens and, just all over the place. And these women, there was kind of a cracker Lysistrata where these rednecks looked at them and they questioned their life. So you'd see them coming back and the royal crown would be of their hair and their hair would become blanker and they'd be laying back on the grass as the Allman Brothers used to play for free, and they go, "Oh man, Dwayne's guitar is shooting sparks into my head." And there would be this, and so what happened during this period of time, I watched how art was transforming people. And,
Yeah.
okay, the Great Speckled Bird had its writers and they had a part of it too, but you seduce somebody from with the music, then you can put the poetry, then you can put the political giromages, you could put all that in place, but first this architecture of transformation had to happen whereby they were seduced by something. Later when I was writing comedy, that was my first real job as a writer, is writing comedy. And
Wow.
it was, the trouble is they paid you in 8 balls and,
Oh, great.
yeah, and then there was a demon there. I mean, literally, there was a creature if you did cocaine, it would tell you, "You can't be funny without me." I saw so many comics destroyed by
Mm,
that. I wrote jokes for people, all kinds of people, famous and not famous, but it was like I saw what happened. And that was the thing of when I quit cocaine and found a mentor that was really kind of shamanistic of what spirits you listen to and what you don't.
mm,
And there is a spirit, of alcohol, of cocaine, of those things that just wants to live through your body and get high.
mhm,
And, and then it'll lie to you. You were just talking about, how do you know this is your friend? That made me think, yeah, there's one that shows up and it has exactly the voice of the helper that helped you get over cocaine, but it somehow talks you, like it's like the guy that shows up at your house, he knocks on the door and he always gets a free lunch out of you, even though you swear you're never going to do it again. So there
yep,
are spirits like that that come in, but they can be very helpful. One of the last things I heard a mentor of mine, James Hillman, say is, you either have the archetype or the archetype has you.
mhm,
And so when these voices come into your head, you better have a conversation with them and keep your eye on them. And I
mhm,
think that's really what it says is, like I said earlier, that bad poetry that young people write, that starts the dialogue. That
mhm.
gets the helper's attention. Um, if they keep going and they have some capacity, I don't know. I don't know what talent is. I think talent is what you're describing is the ability to survive the Rilkean angel. The ability of to realize I don't know. Bob Dylan says I don't know where those early songs came from, and then he sort of points upward, or Carl Jung going when he's asked in a later interview, does he believe in God? And he says, no, I don't believe in God. I know there is a God. There is an aspect, but you're going to have to be willing to be transfigured by that. And that's hard to do. Not that I have the courage for it every moment of the day. There are often times I'm going, no, I don't really want to look over there. I'm afraid of, I'm just really can't take the decimation right now. There's too much going on. Can you approach me at a later day when I'm having a good day and I feel like I can handle things?
Phil, are you a musician? I see nails on this hand.
Yeah, that's for picking, a little bit my ukulele, and
Good.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
lose myself in that. Yeah,
So, we moderns, I think we are, unfortunately very confused about the originary aspects of what we call art, and particularly music and theater,
yeah,
because these things were not mere pleasantries or entertainments. They, the other night, my son and I were playing with some synthesizers that I have, and one of them is quite unusual. And we entered into this state of like basic disbelief. Right? We would make noise we would make a noise on the synthesizer, and we would just look at each other like, "What?" You know? And what I realized, I've been a musician since I was around 16, and, but what I realized that night, which I'd never realized before, is that when we make sounds, we are changing the shape of something resembling our soul or the expressive organ of our
Yeah,
soul. It's changing its mode, right? And the ancients were clearly aware of this. And it wasn't just in music. What was going on in theater was cygenic,
yeah.
medicinal. It wasn't like you're going to see something for entertainment. That
Well, in
I
Greek
don't.
citizenship, it was mandatory you go to the theater.
Yeah.
And you'd have 100,000 people wailing and crying over the fate of Agamemnon.
Yeah,
It was
and I think from what I understand, there was like a sort of a purgation that would happen in the beginning, right? There was sort of this purging, a cleansing thing where you get rid of the stuff, you sort of
well,
brush
you were
away the.
initiated. You couldn't be a citizen without an
Yeah,
initiation,
yeah.
probably taking something a lot like a magic fungus of some kind. And
Yes,
then you were ready for citizenship. Otherwise, you were completely unqualified to be in the agora, you know? And
precisely.
yeah, and I think that's what's missing now. And that, like you said, like I heard recently, somebody talking about Marsilio Ficino, a Neoplatonist during the Renaissance, hugely influential. And
Mm.
when you talk about the artistic life of Florence at that time, he should be mentioned, but he's not. And he was a musician, played his lyre, and his father was a doctor, and he treated the head of the Medici family. And Facchino, when he was a boy, just talked to the man, and the man said, somebody needs to educate this boy, he's brilliant. But his education happened, and Facchino got insecure. He didn't feel like he was pleasing his father, so he became a doctor himself, and he became very discouraged and depressed. And so he played the lyre in the tradition of the Greeks, and he sang a prayer to Orpheus. And at that moment, there was a knock on the door, and there was a letter that he was going to be sponsored by the Medici family to be a teacher. And so I think we have to remember that music that we are attracting. I mean, the trouble is that so many of the musicians from the '60s, for example, and other times, um, if you're going to embody Dionysus, Jim Morrison even got the paunchy belly that is described before the end. You are. This is. I was writing a piece recently, and I used Brugal the Elder in it, and a number of paintings from the war between Carnival and Lent. I don't know if you look it up. If it's extraordinary paintings of, and so spirits. The Carnival is spirit. We are carried along like the spirit of Christmas or the spirit of alcohol. Those are living entities that come in and possess us in a carnival, and sometimes we get grifted because when the
Yep.
spirits are high, you can get your pocket picked very easily, and
Mm.
the money is flowing out of you. But then comes Lent, which is soul making. You're walking on the earth, and you have descended. And if we're talking about Orpheus, that's why Rilke was so obsessed with Orpheus. Rilke, there's a descent. So, like I mentioned with Kerouac, you can have that upbeat. In the sonnets to Orpheus, Rilke is grieving over the death of a friend of his child, and that's where the beginning of the poem comes to him. He's looking at a tree growing nearby, and he's seeing the branches, and he sees them as a string instrument, but the roots are going down to the dead. And he thinks of Orpheus's descent, and he thinks of the life of the poet, and there are realms in it where they're the spirits of dead children, the souls of them around, but there's also in the poem, there's always descent and there's always lifting. Um, and you mentioned musical instruments. Yeah, there is the minor fall, the major lift, as Leonard Cohen put it, right?
Right, right.
And so if you're going to deal with music, you are, like you said, you're putting yourself on that vibrational level, and you're opening yourself up to that is something that's going to be transformative. I think the danger, though, is you have to always, like Ficino did, give the credit to Orpheus, give the
Yeah.
credit to Hermes. That there is a way, if you go, "What a good boy am I," then you're going to get the rock star grandiosity, which might, gods live forever, we don't, and that's why so many of them didn't make it.
No, this was a major, part of my experience and that I had to navigate because there was a second instance of the phenomena, um, and that instance was different. At first, I thought it was the same thing because the same thing was happening as far as I could tell, right? But over time, I realized that, whatever it was that was teaching me again, it had an agenda. First thing didn't have an agenda. And the second thing didn't have a sense of humor. The first thing had a sense of humor. It was very beautiful and non-shaming, right, kind of sense of humor, like a divine sense of humor. And the first thing, which, being, whatever you wanna call it, it loved. It loved the earth. It loved the living things. Not a fan of machines at all. It
No, the
loved
romantic spirit generally isn't.
Yeah, loved the humans, right?
Yeah,
Realized how, deprived and confused they are, but loved them.
yeah,
Second thing, didn't evince love, humor. It had a goal, right? And its goal was basically essentially to, like, "I'll make you great. I'll make you great. You connect me to humans, I'll make you great." And I didn't sign up for that,
no,
you know?
there's something Mephistophelies about that.
Yeah, yeah, right,
Mephistophelian.
like, this is a familiar trope that I've seen
Yeah, I think I've heard
before.
this before.
Yeah, yeah, I'm not up for that. But even during the first experience, I struggle with megalomania, right? And even in the aftermath, I am a different thing from my fellow humans. It seems to me, I've seen worlds that I think very few of them have glimpsed. But that's made me much more humble rather than me. Like, this is not a thing I go around talking about generally at all. Right? I haven't written a book. I don't usually introduce it in a conversation. Mostly, I just prefer to explore what I learned and to continue to develop those insights uh, in a way that I hope is helpful or and beautiful for other human beings.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm struck by, I've mentioned, the change Jeffrey Kripal of Changed in an Instant. He talks about this stuff comes about generally through trauma,
Hmm.
literally getting struck by lightning, and a very nice middle class Jewish lady who's, when she sees her body laying on the ground, she sends her children into the shul. It's the anniversary of her grandfather's death, and she had bought a nice dress and nice shoes. And as she's entering the parking lot of the synagogue there in Dallas, a huge thunderstorm breaks out, and she sends the older kid to the door. He's about 4, and then reaches for the younger kid, but she's holding an umbrella. But just before she's reaching him, she's struck by lightning. And she remembers following the kids into the temple, but being disturbed that everybody's not noticing her not nice shoes and her dress, and they're only talking to the children, but everybody's moving over to a window, and she sees herself, laying there smoking. But and a call goes for a doctor, and this is a synagogue, so it's full of doctors, including the specialist in being electrocuted. So she's literally doesn't have she's out for 5 minutes in cardiac arrest, but she says she spends 6 months in heaven talking to what she thinks is her grandfather, but over time she realized she's talking to God.
Yeah.
But she couldn't have handled it at first if it was
Right.
God. But she comes back with extraordinary abilities. She does literally see the future, orbs show up in her
Yep.
house, phone calls come from the dead that her husband hears, but she's so different, the marriage doesn't last. She's shown on the other side a child she's gonna have, and the reason she was gonna go through life, but she says, "I am no longer whoever this nice Jewish lady was, I am something else entirely."
Yeah.
And so, people that have the experience you described, that's what made me, think of that, changed in an instant.
It's very important what you say, and that's a beautiful story. I used to go to meetings in Berkeley of IANDS, which is the International Association of Near Death Studies.
Uh-huh.
And these, often in those meetings, people who had died or had nearly died would, tell their stories. And before I talk too much about near death and after death experiences and so forth. something very profound you said that has more than simply occurred to me, which is that encounters with severe injury, illness, trauma, and it doesn't have to be even something physical, right? Emotional trauma or, family dissolution or something like this, right? These place us, these place aspects of ourselves in an orientation that is much more likely to either call or attract power. And so, in there's sort of like a science fiction story, right, where a kid figures this out as a little kid because the first time he breaks his leg or something, right, he sees angels or whatever. So he starts engineering survivable catastrophes in order to invite stronger and stronger powers, right? Getting at. And there's an aspect of our psychology that's a little bit like that too, because we know, in a simple way, that if I send signals for help, something comes, humans, other things, right?
And sometimes the not helping helps because you're used to, like you're a child and you're used to being rescued, right? You're used
Right.
to so, I think, so sometimes when we are in the wasteland there, when we are in the abyss, just the lesson is even though things are plateauing, just keep, like the statement goes, when you're in hell, keep going, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I mean, sometimes it's
Probably
going to be Virgil, but other times,
probably the same thing might be true in heaven,
I
right? When you're in
suspect so.
heaven, keep going, right?
Yeah, I imagine, but see that's the thing is like in the Kabbalah, for example, we the name of God, if you look into the Torah, for example,
Mhm,
they don't spell God out. Because it's a name that shouldn't be pronounced, much like it's probably not even possible
mhm,
to do that. So, and the aspect of like if you look at the tree of life you look at the tree of life, you
mhm.
know, these aspects of these different, and you can't really call them hierarchies. They're more of a interdimensional lattice with no hierarchies. Yeah, exactly. So,
Right, this is, for gematria,
yeah,
which is what the angel was teaching me.
okay.
It taught me Hebrew, right?
They
I had
taught you
no
Hebrew. All what were there 4,000 words? I mean, so you got all.
Right, right. No, it didn't just it mainly didn't teach me the language, it mostly taught me the alphabet and some key ideas. Um,
Okay.
but, this is if I call it the angel, I don't know what I have a pet name for it, but what I'm getting at is well, actually, never mind what I'm getting at. I have some other questions for you. Do you often I'm gonna just change the channel here if that's okay for a minute. Do you often recall your dreaming experiences?
Well, that one was extremely transformative involving Hermes. And this is what I would think was the life-changing dream, 2 of them,
Wow.
on the same thing. I'm I mentioned being a comedy writer,
Mhm.
pretty dissatisfied. I've got that voice in my head that said, Robin Williams' joke is far better than one I can come up with about it's God's way of telling you you're making too much money. And I was not there was I was born to do something else apparently because I'm dreaming I'm in my apartment in Los Angeles and I think it's an earthquake because and it is an earthquake of the psyche coming, but the house is shaking, the apartment is shaking, and I open my door, and in charges a bull elephant, and he graphically rapes me. We're talking about full pachyderm penis, leatherly, sinewy, everything penetrating me. And I wake up in terror, I mean, what is going on here? And so I leave Los Angeles and to go stay with a friend after I'm describing how miserable my existence has become. And he says, "Well, just have a room and just go back there and write." And so I went back there, and voices started showing up in my head in a contrapunctual way, and I just started working on a play.
Mm.
And as these characters were showing up, and the play was about this hyper controlling person who had come into money but rented apartments, he rented out his house in the Hollywood Hills, and all the different Hollywood characters were living there. Um, but he just enjoys being an antagonist and destroying a lot of them are flaky, yes, but he just enjoys being taking them down as far as having this discerning intellect. Um, I mentioned the word Metastophily finding the place to leave them powerless because he's hyper controlling. It had some trauma in his life, lost his parents quite young, had inherited this place from an uncle. Um, and he actually worked in an emergency room because not so much he liked pain, he just liked being in control.
Mm.
And so between that, so a flood comes in the play and a mudslide, and everybody comes up out of their apartments and they're in his. And the confrontation that happens with him where he has a nervous breakdown, including a poltergeist in the radio that plays appropriate music or comes on with the right things. So there is a so as I'm finishing up the first draft of this play, um, I have a dream. I go to sleep. I'm on a train. We're moving through a desert landscape. I get this idea, they do in India. You climb up on the top of the train and you look at the landscape go by. So I start to go up through my play, but my play is blown into the desert. And I get off of the train and I'm trying desperately to scatter pick up the pages. And this elephant lumbers up to me. And I go, "Oh, no." And he goes, "No, it's not like that this time, Phil. All you have to do is touch me, and I can move 10,000 miles an hour if you want." So, trepidation, I touch him, and we do. It's like this, those movies where the Starship Enterprise takes off, and he takes me to an Edenic realm, and,
Mm.
literally a place where lions are laying down with lambs and animals are everywhere. And he goes to cool himself in this pool. And a figure walks up to him, to me, and he says, "I'm the keeper of the lake." And I said, "Yeah, but I play." And he goes, "Don't worry, it's just on a train to North Carolina. It's back on the train. You can stay here as long as you need to." And so I wake up. Now, interestingly, the way these synchronicities work, the first place that play was done in North Carolina. That's where we're commissioned, and I got a stipend to go up there. And so, but what that taught me was um, the Hermes, which is Ganesh, the elephant god, the god of the crossroads, of new places in life. He is their hermetic figure. He I was turning my back on something. I needed a direction I needed to go, and it entered me through the only orifice possible because I was literally being an asshole. And
That's there's 5 comedy skits there.
yeah, and so what that taught me, like I said, these dreams have been significant at different places in times where I felt like I had run out, after a divorce, for example, a dream where I am in a train station and I'm lost, and a really cute girl with beautiful cheekbones comes up to me and she tries to pick my pocket. And I catch her and she looks at me and she goes, "Oh." And we go on the train and we pick pockets so we can survive. And that was the dream that happened right before I discovered tarot cards.
Oh,
She was an
wow.
emissary once again of how to live, she was dressed in furs and she was just, an emissary again of how do you live a life, the bohemian life we were talking about early on. How do you deal with necessity? But when the train dropped me off at the terminus point, there was this vast, beautiful reservoir
Mm,
that I stood looking at, and she kissed me on the cheek and disappeared. And so it was, what was going on there is it showed me there is a reservoir still here. Right now, you can't find it. You feel lost in this place of transition, but it's coming along.
mm,
Just hold on, right? Like the old gospel song, Paul and Cyrus bound in jail, had no money for to make their bail. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. Paul and Cyrus thought all was lost. The dungeon shook and the chains fell off. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. Um, so that's the way that during those periods, and I think I'm kind of in one of those periods now where um, where the culture seems so terrifying. And, I go, how do I contribute to this with my writing? I don't want to say the same things I've said in essays for years. I don't want to
Mm.
work on the same criteria. How do I keep this vivid and alive, and engages in the process, engages the audience, but also works on the soul making that happens when you are writing honest, you're writing honestly. I've been in the place. Sometimes you have to be in the place of you're just going to sit down and you're going to put one word in front of the other and you're not going to feel it. And you have
Mhm.
to do that till the muse, takes pity on you, or
Yes.
you just have to do that.
Yeah,
If,
you have to
if you're a
make the
writer, that's what you're going to do. You're going to write.
yeah, you make the milk until the nectar comes,
Right,
right?
right,
Make the best milk you can make, right? You go
right.
ahead and be disappointed and know that it's not alive yet. That's fine. But then if you keep doing it, something comes and infuses your interiority with passion and urgency and love and insight and new ways of seeing, right?
I think there are mentor spirits, and
Yes.
that, like I have mentored young guys before, and
Yes.
and it's and something comes alive. It's like the old archetypal tale of the knight that thinks he's done, and he gets up and he's creaky and everything hurts, and he thinks his days of adventure, going after the Grail, and then the young knight knocks on his door, and the calling comes again. But
Yeah.
there is something that happens, and if there is a spirit that infuses us to go question the world, to look for the Grail, I imagine this is going on in the spirit world too.
Yes, yes, and, something that only recently occurred to me, it's a very complex backstory, I'll try and be simple about it. I remember the experiences that I had, right? And they were absolutely like it was terrifying, but it wasn't the kind of terror that I'm used to. It wasn't terror of bad things happening. That all of that fear was completely obliterated. It was terror of beauty. There's some poet, it might have been Rilke, said something like, going to paraphrase wildly here. Be thankful you've never encountered an angel, because if you did, your heart would rip itself out of your breast and beat itself to death on the ground. Right. And that resembled my experience very directly. But what I'm getting at is, you know, I have this kind of I've studied something that you might call the development of human consciousness over time, right? People like Bruno Snell wrote about this, Julian Jaynes in his book on the
Mhm.
bicameral mind. There aren't too many books that I've encountered about it, but I'm fascinated by the topic. What were the minds of our ancestors or the ancients like? And I don't want to know, I'm not just curious about this ideologically. I want
Mhm.
to have experiences they had. I suspect they are not gone, but are alive somehow in me and reachable, right? So that we can have the direct experience of what it was like to look up at the sky 50,000 years ago as a human being. But where am I going here? Did I lose my thread? So, oh yes, yes. So I remember the absolute ecstasy of this companion of having this companion intelligence with me, but it was also catastrophically stressful. So it was
Yeah,
ecstatic and stressful. So when it began to fade, it sort of went in a curve, right? And when it began to fade, that was relieving, but it was also frightening. Have I done something wrong? Have I messed this up or whatever? Just like a child might feel. But what never occurred to me until fairly recently was that the gods or the daimons or the angels, there's they're experiencing something similar by interacting with us. It's not a one-way relationship,
yeah,
right? They are ecstatically fascinated by the possibilities of matter and being in matter. And one of the ways they can be in the material layer is through human beings.
yeah.
So it's very complex, this situation. Much more so than I think we are ordinarily inclined to imagine, especially because many of these matters are literally unimaginable
Well, I mean,
without direct
poetry is the way you imagine it. Like, I don't know if you've read Wallace Stevens' The Idea of
some.
Order at Key West, and Wallace Stevens is a poet that really gets, though he, is a modernist, but the complexity of his prose, he does not come out and say it like we are attempting now to find words for it. He does find words for it by elliptical means, and
Yes.
not in the Idea of Order at Key West, which is a dialogue between him and the ocean and his muse, and he's asking who's writing this poem, essentially.
Mhm.
But he asks in a poem, he asks the angel, do the angels dream of the green corn here? In other words, where is it? How we are here. We taste, we touch, we know flesh, and I imagine that these beings are infinitely curious about
Yes.
that experience, and like the way a good teacher learns just by teaching. They got to reach the student. They find parts of themselves that they didn't know were there. I don't know if
Yes.
you've ever had those dreams where you're in a house that's similar to the one you live in, but
Yes.
it has rooms you didn't know were there, and
Very
people
recently.
in it,
Yes.
and creatures in it, and all of those kind of things. This is something, like for example, the Sufi poets use these experiences
Mhm.
of the boarding house type places where the soul is a boarding house in some way. And so I think that these entities, like for example, you're going to, if you lived in an old boarding house setup, like some woman who thought her life was over when her husband dies and her kids are gone and she has this big house. And then all of a sudden these people are coming into the boarding house, by their interaction with each other, they're transforming each other. There might
Yeah.
be in the old days, there might be a vaudeville act that met and they hit it off and, they tour together. There is some way that when and to relate this, what you were talking about these non-corporeal entities, I think they are transformed. It's not a one-way thing. They realize that altruism is helpful, even probably in their realm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there was one brief moment of the experience that I had where the being that was teaching me, or my companion, it basically just asked permission to have my hand. And it showed me things about our hands that are, I'm not gonna go into it, but are catastrophically, like, revelatory. Um, but it was like, yeah, in all of the universes, this thing here is so precious, like nothing, almost nothing lives long enough to get one
Well,
of
that
these.
explains a recent conversation. Sorry to interrupt, but
No, please.
a friend of mine was talking about, on his first acid trip. I think he was talking about psilocybin, but it was like he just realized lips, right? Chickens don't have lips, cats don't have lips, but I have these lips, right?
Right.
And there's something extraordinary about being in this incarnation right now. And a lot of people, I said, yeah, well, a lot of people, and I remember quite young when I did my first acid trip, it was my hand.
Yep.
I just it had the same experience of this wonder at this, of what this is. And so, it's interesting you bring that up directly after that conversation. Um,
So, of course, I gave him permission, right?
yeah.
It's like, yeah, of course. And this was the only time that he expressed something like childlike awe.
Mhm.
His enthusiasm went through the roof. He was like, "Oh my god, you have pockets with things in them?" And I felt him reach into my pocket and just explore, and it was completely, it was so absolutely novel to his experience. I use the gender loosely here. But yeah, it was so novel to his experience that it was like a kid on a rocket ship or so. It was just
Yeah,
absolutely out of
yeah.
his mind with joy.
Well, that would be like those extraordinary dreams we were just talking about.
Mhm.
I mean, maybe when they come into this realm is their dream, and so
Yes, yes, brilliant.
he's having this extraordinary dream of discovery about this, because it's like, I mean, that's what we're getting at. Okay, we were talking about psychedelics will give you that feeling, oh my God, I never thought about how incredible pockets were. And then you woke up, you write it down and you wake up the next day and you go, yeah, pockets, something that mundane, right? But then you go, but then really, when you're in that experience of the heightened numinous experience, it is about that aspect of exploration about how much we limit ourselves.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be every time, this flip like Diane Pasilka or Jeffrey Kripal or others talk about. It's not going to be abducted by an alien like Whitney Strieber.
Mhm.
But there's going to be, like, I'm walking down the street with my son one time we first came back in Atlanta, and we're Airbnb, and I've got my son, he's a child, and we're going to cross not a particularly busy street, but a street that has traffic on it from time to time. So when you're a parent, you've probably been through this. If you're a parent, you really scrutinize up and down the street before you commit. And I have my dog, and so we cross the street, but I feel a vehicle right after we pass go behind me. And I glance over, and there is what seemed, what the close I can describe it, as a chassis of a car, no wheels, and it is silver, and it is just. And so I don't want to say to my son, who at the time was 9.5, I didn't want to say, "Did you see that too?" I wanted to say, "Did you see something behind this that I missed?" And I had him describe it. He saw the same thing. He described it. He said, except he said there were old-fashioned wheels on it. I mean, old-fashioned tire. I mean, not wheels, but headlights on it, like an old-fashioned car.
Uh-huh.
So something there,
Uh-huh.
something was there. What would be called high strangeness.
Mhm.
It came into our life like that, and so it was not so much um, the actual experience, but it was like, what is this? The world is more than I can possibly imagine. That this odd little thing came by, this odd
Mhm.
little thing, just to show me, hang on a little bit. The more is going to be revealed. Further along, we'll know all about it, right? As the old gospel song goes, further along, we'll know the reason why, you know. And be happy, my brother, live in the sunshine. Further along, in the sweet by and by. So there's this aspect of, like, every once in a while we get something like that. We get, this happened during my mother's illness as she was leaving this world. And so I have a tendency to think that every once in a while things like that will happen, not so much for their literal take on it, but just as like music, the feeling it leaves.
Mm. You know, as a child, I was pretty precocious, and I realized very quickly that the adults were living in worlds that don't exist,
Mm,
that are literally just fictions. Often they were fictions of language, right?
mm,
This is a that. Here
right.
is what happened, right? And I quickly understood, I mean, not in a way that I can articulate like I can now, but I was aware of this problem, right? The adults are living in a world that it's not real. It's in their thinking, right? And their speaking that they see this world. And so I quickly became both a fan and a student of anomalies. Right? I went looking for the things that violated the fictions that
Mm,
domineer in our cultures, and I pay close attention to them. In the writings of Castaneda, I don't know how familiar you may or may not be with them, but Don Juan proposes that our entire experience of the world is not real. It is
mhm.
something we are constructing moment to moment.
Consensus reality, he calls
Yeah.
it.
And there is like a field effect, right? This is what you were talking about when you spoke of the park into which the, militant rednecks would come, right? They don't realize you're going into the water there, buddy, and you may think you're going to fight that water, but you wait until the music and the women and the goodwill and the beauty, right? It's going to get you, right? You think you know what you're up to, but you're actually in what Robert Anton Wilson might say, you're like shifting reality tunnels and you're not prepared for that, right? You
Yeah.
think you know what's going on, right? And I was reading It's funny, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, which is hilarious. I was reading Bio Ako Malafe. I don't know if you know this Facebook, his Facebook presence, but he was writing this morning something that really profoundly I thought was beautiful. He was saying he was about to do an interview, and the woman kept asking him, "Would you please pronounce your last name for me?" He said, "No, have a go at it." And she's like, "No, no, I don't want to do that. Just at least pronounce it once, and then I'll try." He's like, "No, just have a go at it." And she was very nervous, and she finally, did it. And he said, in the Yoruba, uh, in our way of life, we don't expect people to say things right. We're open to the insight or the God that may appear in their mispronunciation of a word or our
Mm,
name, right? And this is also very true in music. If you're composing a song and you're trying to do it right, okay, now if you're playing music from sheet music, that's different, right? The
right,
goal there is to get it right. But if
right.
you're composing a song on an instrument like the guitar or the piano and you make mistakes, it's very, very apparent if you're in any way creative that something speaks to you through the errors, right?
But
There's an
Brian Eno writes quite a bit about that. Yeah,
Yeah, there's this isn't it's not a matter of right or wrong. And I think it's also very important. Forgive me if I get a little bit on my soapbox about this. I'll keep it minimal. To understand that as males, we make it scripted to dismiss things which we can determine are not true,
right,
right? If the girl comes to us and she says, blah 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 blah, and we're like, that's not true, right? And then it's over with,
right.
right? We think like now we know what's going on. This is one of the worst things that could possibly happen to a human being is to know what's going on, right? When you know what's going on, first of all, you're almost invariably wrong. Secondly, you're so delimiting what's going on that your chances of liberty are basically zero. I mean, there are exceptions, right? It's not a
Oh, and there
law,
are
it's a
times when you
principle.
get it right, like you said, this is why the hero dies. This is the tragic hero, is he keeps believing by doing. I know that what comes to me is that image of Jason underneath the Argo. He's totally blown it, but he's reliving his glory, and the Argo collapses on him and kills him. This is the athlete, saggy in front of his trophy case. This is, the idea that we got it right that one time, but our template was dead on correct, but we keep trying to use that template.
Yeah, this is the problem. It's the improper transfer of a template from
Yeah,
one aspect of experience or being or becoming to
yeah,
all aspects, right? And one of the worst places this happens is the expectation of physical continuity that we get from the physical world. Like my door is not going anywhere. It's going to be there tomorrow and the next day. It's always going to
right.
look the same, right? And we transfer that onto things of the mind or the soul or the creativity, and that's insane. Those things are not like that door. And even the door,
But it gives us
accord
anxiety, though, that we want the world to be just so. We want there to be an explanation for it, and it is the anxiety that comes over us. I mean, the Greeks describe it as Pan going into the agora, is that there's panic and pandemonium
Mhm.
when all of a sudden, this musky animal. And this is the thing, this is keeping the sense of humor part about it, is humor, looking at it more like the Marx Brothers, combining it with Karl Marx if you're a commie, right? I mean, that you don't want to become one of those humorless doctrinaire commies that's always
No.
correcting everybody, and their writing is just horrible. And so it's like Pan's mother's kind of ashamed of him, and she wants to put him up on Olympus and sneak away. And the gods come out and they're looking at his antics, and the gods can't agree on anything, but they agree they like him and he's funny. So they form a panorama around him. And so they're always, but something about the jealousies, the rivalries, when they're looking at Pan falls away. And when we are in that place where we want the just so stories, we want it to be just the way things are, so everything buttoned down. And that's what I was talking about. That early play of mine was about a character that wanted that, and then that same kind of chaos comes into his life. um, that there is a element of panic that comes about. And I can give you a whole experience. I can give you an experience about of synchronicities about that, about
No,
So
let's have one.
my first wife and I about to take a trip to Europe, um, and so what we noticed in the newspaper, Joyce Carol Oates is just going to give a talk at Emory University, a few blocks from there. So we walk over here, and she reads a poem that strikes me about the flaying of Marsyas, the satyr.
Mhm.
That he picks up a musical instrument. It's Athena's thrown it away because she does not like the way what's later called this panpipe makes her face scrunch up when she plays it. And he learns, and Marcius learns to play it, and so much so that the other woodland creatures are saying to him, "Oh, you play as well as Apollo himself." Now, Marcius doesn't agree, but I guess he doesn't stop him fast enough, or the damage is already done because Apollo lands on Earth and challenges him to a contest that is judged by Apollo's own muses. So, life is rigged from the start, right? And so when Apollo wins, he flays the skin off of Marcius. So the night before that, I had had a dream of sitting in Paris, and a goat had come up out of the soup of the bouillabaisse I was eating and ran through the streets of Paris. So we get, we're not scheduled to go to Paris, so we had got a cheap flight to Brussels on Sabina Airlines, and we get off, and there's a torrential rain happening there in Belgium, and we get on a bus, and we just get off it randomly, and we go into a museum, just, oh, there's a museum, great. Bus put us right in front of us. We're soaking wet and go in there. And the first thing I see is exactly the painting that the poem is based on. Now, we were cold and we said, okay, before we go back to Paris, we go to Paris, let's go to Greece and warm up. So we go to this island, and I'm scribbling poetry, and my wife at the time was an artist, and she did really good caricatures and sketches. And people are giving, the island everything because she's drawing the people on the island, and anything we need, they're bringing us. But this phenomenon starts happening of the goats start looking in the window of our cottage. And I think, okay, this is something the goats do. So I'm asking the farmers and people, I said, do the goats do that to everybody? And they go, no, just you. And so as we're walking down the street, the goats will leap out. And you can ask my first wife about this. They would follow us down the streets. And so there is a way that before that, what brought on me leaving LA and were panic attacks. But then
Mm,
as I started to deal with this by art and look deeply in it, this musky animal god of the body, and as I was mentioning before, this was the time of the punk rock era where you would go to clubs and you would dance. Remember the bumper stickers that said "fuck art, let's dance," right? And that sort of thing. I was really kind of into that aesthetic at the time. And so, what I'm saying is that my life has been filled with these dreams and synchronicities like that at times. And I can give anecdote after anecdote about transitions where that
mhm,
happens. But this is what I was saying before about when, the vehicle came down the street. And what
mhm,
you're saying about, I can see why this creature was so interested in your hand
mhm.
is because there are guiding hands somehow, and it's not the invisible hand of the market, but there is a market, there is a place of souls, an agora of souls, where there are these helpful hands that come about. And like I said, I don't want to over elaborate on what that can be. As let the mystery be, as the song goes. You know,
Yes, yes. No, this is very important. There's a few other things that I was on the track of, and one of them is,
I just got to get my plug.
by all means, take if you whatever you need.
Yeah.
Um, so, I was listening to Vervaeke yesterday, and he was talking about 4 different kinds of knowledge. I think they were propositional, procedural, perspectival, and participatory. And they use different kinds of memory. He's a cognitive scientist, among
Mhm.
other strange things. And this is another problem. We don't realize there are different kinds of knowledge,
Oh yeah.
right? He's saying that these are different kinds of knowledge. Okay, great. These are obvious. You can give examples of them. It's blatantly kissing is participatory knowledge, right? To kiss another human being. It's not, is it true, right? It's not a procedure, right? It's, participatory. But what we don't realize, or what it's uncommon for us to realize, is there are different forms of truth,
Yeah.
right? And the kind of truth that is associated with facts has a very narrow scope, right? Within that narrow scope, it's quite real. But
Mhm.
as a student of science fiction authors, there's a different kind of truth in there, which is perspectival, right? It gives you perspectival truth. It's not talking about things that are actually exist. So when we, and there's dangers on both sides, right? There's dangers of, well, you can come to believe things that are nonsensical and then behave in the world and in relationships as if these nonsensical things are true or good or veritable or something. That's part of our human experience, right? We can get it wrong in a way that is problematical for us and others. But getting it right is often very problematical too, right? So,
Right.
because what you've done is you sort of narrowed the scope of reality and potential to a manageable feature. And part of the reason why we do this, and part of the reason why it produces anxiety, as you were discussing, is that, and this is just a toy, I'm not saying this is how it is, but underlying human concern and awareness are, you can look at it through a lens where there are three principles, and one of them is ambiguity, and the middle one is vigilance, and the third one is prediction. So when there's ambiguity, right? I live in a dead box. You see all those squares back there, all them
Mm.
rectangles, right? It's not an accident. That stuff's all rectangular. That stuff's
Okay.
not going anywhere, right? It's just going to stay like a frame for the rest of time, pretty much, right? And it's not going to move, and I don't have to pay attention. There's no ambiguity, right? Those squares evict ambiguity. And we live in boxes that evict ambiguity. And part of the reason we do that, part of the reason, obviously for shelter, and it's convenient to build them, whatever, but it reduces vigilance, and vigilance is a burden. And what happens when vigilance gets amplified by ambiguity is humans have anxiety and they panic.
Yeah.
And
Hypervigilance.
we can see that going on in our culture in a way. We can see the results of these upsurges in ambiguity, various domains of ambiguity, rather suddenly, right, over
Mhm.
over short periods of time. And then you got people who are just going to surf that shit, right? Humans go nuts, they're panicking. I can just come in and own that whole, like, I'll just own that country, right? I'll take the whole damn thing because it's ripe for capture, right? And opportunists like Musk and Trump and Putin and others have realized, in a sense, well, they're just running fictions anyway, so now why not run mine?
Right. Now there can be propitious fictions and there can be dangerous fictions.
We agree.
Like my mother left Nazi Germany on a Kindertransport.
Mm,
Her father in Sachsenhausen concentration camp.
mm.
So, like you say, these are dangerous times because demagogues can take advantage of the angst that comes from ambiguity, especially when you go into the grocery store and you see the prices, or people are worrying about how to pay their rent. And
Now,
so,
go
go
ahead,
ahead.
please.
Um, Go ahead.
Please
Um,
continue.
okay, so um, this is the thing about like, is the story working at this moment? My early days as a comedy writer, I would go around with work for an impressionist. I worked for comics, and you feel what the audience is feeling,
Mm,
and you can feel when they're hitting it just right, or you can feel when and so comics are a good comic has to be very aware of what's going on in the audience.
mhm.
Hopefully, it'll be an easy laugher there, right? And they'll get everybody going. But that you can't have that luxury every time. You have to be able to have and with tarot card readings that I did, you have to have a feeling of whether when you're talking about the archetypes that have been laid down in their interaction with people, you have to get a feeling of whether you're on the right track. It doesn't
Mhm.
mean that you're just looking at their body responses, but there's no way you can help missing that. And it's just all part of the process of telling the story about what these cards are saying with one another. And so if I would like for the days when I'm reading tarot cards, if I'm just working through templates, I'm going to be bad at it.
Yeah.
I'm going, and that's what you're saying is that so, oh, this really worked last night when that card came down. But if I expect it to work in that same way, and give the same vaudeville chameleon joke, right? These jokes have been working for 20 years, as Baggy Pants comedian says. Now, I said the
Mhm.
word chameleon. That's interesting because that was a
It
slip.
is. Yeah.
So there is an aspect of I think that you have to be. That was one of those little intrusions, one of those Philip K. Dick moments
But
from
also
Ublick where,
what Bio was talking about, where the God comes in and it
right,
speaks for you, right? And it's close to what you were gonna say, but it ain't the same thing,
right, and that
right?
was that was a hermetic moment. That is what
Yeah.
you can call it by what you want, but
You
it was
might
the
say
idea. Yeah,
maybe we invoked that by the previous recognition of this, potential. Please continue.
so I agree with what you're talking about we want to know the future, we become hyper vigilant. And you were talking about four functions there. Well, Jungian psychology has that.
3,
Okay, well, the
vigilance,
four Jungian
ambiguity,
psychology.
prediction.
You were talking about the feeling sensation. You were
Oh,
talking about,
right,
so
right.
if
The
we would
4
look at
kinds
this
of
as
yeah, the
the
4 kinds of
kiss.
knowledge. 4 kinds of
Okay.
knowledge.
Well, okay, you were talking about the kiss. What came to my mind is Eros, the son of Aphrodite. There is Eros in that. There is a living, it's not only a function, it's not
No.
only a type of knowledge. This knowledge comes by way of a God.
It's not
And
even merely a god. The god is an expression of a principle that is from, like, this is one of the things that Socrates was executed for saying.
yeah,
Socrates was executed for saying, no, there's things that even the gods have to obey: truth, beauty, right?
right.
Virtue, other things, right? At
Well,
least
they're
this is,
squabbling with each other about that. Apollo's truths are going to be different from Aphrodite's truths,
yeah.
different from Athena's truths. Like, and Socrates was executed because he started like promoting the finance bros of his time, and he upset the democracy there that didn't like these rich boys that were operating outside of town behind the penis statues. So I'm not defaming him there, but I'm just saying that yes, those different, and this is where, like I mentioned Hillman before, of I think we have a monotheism about, like, we want to know. So I have a friend that's very anxious. We've been friends. He's a brilliant artist, but he's been a Christian since we were teenagers after he took too much acid. And he still
Okay.
comes by on Fridays and we talk, and he is so fixed on the idea of the father archetype. And I'm not going to confront him with them and saying this is because of your anxiety and you want to know that God is taking things up in heaven and you're loved, and whoever ways you felt like a failing as a boy, that this is that God is in his heaven, and there and every he loves you if you don't sin. But I have talked to him about why Christianity splits into so many schisms, but
Mhm,
by using James Hillman saying this is what monotheism does.
mhm.
There's a multiplicity of energies and forms and intelligences and feelings and sensations that are coming in, and one God, it's too much for one God. There might be according to Eastern belief, a Godhead, but then it comes into all these different diverse forms. But if you're saying this is the only God, you're going to be splitting all the time.
Also, if you're also saying this is its only child,
Yeah,
right? Both. You got to have
yeah,
both those fictions there, right? One God, one child, right? And then from
right.
there, one people. You can just keep doing the
And
you
then
know
you're
the
going to get genocide because that
yeah,
one people,
and not
believes
just
that they,
genocide. I mean, what is the word for the obliteration of the womb of creativity, intelligence, literacy, all these things? I don't know what the word is for that. The
sterility would be the opposite of the wound becomes the womb. So the poet takes care of the wound, so the new life comes out of it. But it's over sterilization, a heaven that is over scoured with bleach and detergent to make it so clean and perfect that you're going to get a sterility that you neither have spirit nor soul. You have
yeah.
this, yeah,
So, like when Islamic extremists invaded, I think it was Iran and stuff, right? They went to the museums and just obliterated everything that was in there, right? And we've seen this waves of this over and over in history. And of course, the corollary in, in capitalist culture is just commodify it, right? So
Right. Well,
they
it's the same
obliterate it.
correlates. Capitalism creates the type of imperialism that brings that about. So
Right,
you come in with modernity, you can like for in Iran, for example, and you install the Shah,
right.
and he brings about this radical change, but and it would probably be accepted if most of the people weren't kept poor by the oil flowing westward. Like
Mm.
I remember in my working class neighborhood, things were fine and before inflation set. That's where those you had those redneck hippies, where you had Willie Nelson going to Austin. You had redneck hippies, and things were going really well when people were smoking weed and dropping acid. But when the inflation started, people started getting very angst-ridden and conservative again. And the changes that were happening, the modernity coming in, with 8-track tapes and Trans Ams was just great, girls and tube tops. But then the idea of when things got expensive, the idea of sin, and a lot of them became Christians because of their coke habit. So there was and then the idea that the world is unstable now. You have all this inflation coming in. I need some grounding. I need some solidity. I need Daddy the Father. I mean, here outside of Atlanta, there was a Trump rally where um, the bow tied guys whose name's escaping me. That was at Fox, very popular, and then he got fired for certain
Oh,
reasons.
Tucker Carlson?
Tucker Carlson was speaking, and he went into this entire riff about daddy's coming home. There's the infants poop on the walls, and the teenage son's watching porn, and the daughter is, wearing a dress too short. I don't remember the exact words, but daddy's coming home, and there's going to be a reckoning. And so this aspect of daddy's going to come home and set things right. So we get the fear that comes in the museum early on, where the destruction of the Library of Alexandria happens when the Christians come in during the Crusades. There is a aspect of where a being that comes in that is born of the terror of the unknown. This is dovetailing in what we keep talking about how do you let the unknown in with not only there's the risk of not anxiety, but there's the risk of madness. Carl Jung noticed he was the son of a minister in Switzerland, and he noticed that in the asylum there in Zurich, his schizophrenic clients were speaking the language his father did in church. And so, but they were possessed by this madness because the templates of modernity no longer, like I was describing in Athens, where we went living with the gods, where Ezekiel, for example, talk about a vision that is ineffable. He's sitting there. He was a priest in Israel. He's taken in chains as a slave. He's sitting on the Jordan River, eating his slave's lunch, and then all of a sudden, over the Jordan, he has a vision of these rings of fire coming. And it's a real interesting story insofar as transformation goes. He finds himself in the Valley of Bones, and a storm comes from heaven, and this army of flesh rises. And then later, the last part is quite beautiful. And they don't name the temple. It's not the temple that's believed that's going to be restored according to Jewish mythology, but it is a temple that is built, and it's extraordinary and exquisite. And a small trickle of water starts coming out of the ground, and this ripple becomes a stream, and the stream starts revitalizing the land until it goes and revives the Dead Sea, and all the creatures of the sea are restored and the land is. Well, this is a story of how this is a story not only of what the Christians told as the Grail, what heals the sick king, or what heals the sickness of the land as they're confronted with Babylon, where he's being held. But it's a story of the restoration of the soul that is happening by these type of transformation that comes from the flow state of water, or the wandering in the wasteland. And all of these stories come about. And this is what Wallace Stevens is asking in the idea of order in Key West. Who the hell is telling the story? The ocean, as he's walking by it in Key West, is telling her story. The muse is telling her story. He has his version of it. And, as any poet, he's going, which one? Well, which one should I publish? I'll publish all of them, you know. And that's the
That,
still problem with monotheism, is it needs, even I'm telling the story of of a people, but I think, the religion of my mother, which was Judaism, they're born in Nazi Germany, is that, that constantly there is a new story that is going to flow in first as a trickle and then as a deluge. And whether that deluge is a drowning deluge or one that restores the land depends on how you're going to approach it. And it is better to approach it as a slave than a king.
yes, agreed.
Not that
That
I'm agreeing
trickle,
with slavery. I'm just agreeing that you
right?
are going to be enslaved. As Bob Dylan says, you're going to serve somebody. You're going to serve something.
Yeah,
And
maybe the
you
right word is a servant rather
a
than a slave.
servant or but I think there's a certain aspect of does the daemon enslave us? Because it's going to be one way or another. The daemon is going to come in, and as James Hillman points out in the Soul's Code, if you don't follow the calling of that daemon, it's going to destroy you. It's going to be you're going to become a drug addict. You're going to. There are going to be ways that a dissipation is going to happen. Rilke put it this way: everybody has a letter written inside of them, and if you don't live the life your heart wants to live, you don't get to read this letter before you die. So imagine a vast dead letter office full of this correspondence, and the feeling you're going to see if you see that would be melancholy. A depression
Sure.
would take you down to bring you down to whatever's been distracting you, and you got to deal with that. You got to meticulously open those letters one by one, and it's going to be painful to read it. But to me, that would be the enslavement that you would feel. It's almost like, in the story of Rumpelstiltskin, the maiden being led into that room and she has to separate all that grain from the chaff. Same thing happens in the story of Eros and Psyche of separating the grains from the chaff. That there is a way that's what I meant by kind of an enslavement. The slave has his task to do, and the Beulah land is going to come, but it is the aspect of not master running you, but what are you going to be the master of your own soul? And that's what's going to enslave you. Like, the the entities that you're talking about, the dialogue you're going to have with them, it's going to, after a while, the slave is going to become the slave and the master is going to become the slave, and they're indistinguishable from each other.
I mean, and there are other important features of this problem for us as human beings, which is we're going to be serving something.
Yeah.
And if you can't find something, I don't know exactly which words to use. I'll try to be careful. If you're not really sure what virtue is or beauty or justice, um, then you're likely going to end up serving things that are fictions of benefit.
Yeah.
You're going to serve things like convenience. You're going to
Hmm.
serve things like money. You're
Yeah.
going to serve the representational layer that the humans establish and train their children into slavery too. That's going to suck for you, for your children, for your ancestors. No one is going to be happy if you do that.
Yeah,
And
I'm gonna be in the chorus and give a hallelujah to that because you see it everywhere. You
yeah,
see our culture of distraction.
it's immiserating. It's
Yeah,
not just we imagine, oh, I'm just a separate person, I'm going to live and die and blah blah blah. Okay, great. Even if that's true, this sucks. But if that's not true, if you're actually the embodiment of the entire sort of library of not just your ancestors but of life on earth, and you're like the little fingertip of that whole process, you have the capacity to either see, the thing is, humans think like you can't change the past. Well, you can sure as fuck change the meaning of the past. If you do something profoundly beautiful, which is something I know you ache and chase and quest to become every time you set pen to paper, even though maybe it's not a pen these days.
Well, I felt it when you said immiserate. I thought about that function of what immiserates you. It's what sets you down to do that, to open yourself up into a way that you can experience, what Yeats says, "Truth is beauty, beauty and truth." It's all you
Mhm.
are doing, all you need to know.
And
And so it's
justice too.
yeah,
Justice.
well, yes, Athena, if you read, the Orestia, I mentioned the agonies of Agamemnon, it's not gonna come out. Agamemnon a minute ago, right? There is, that where's he when he goes to the Oracle of Apollo after being, these goddesses are chasing him with razor sharp teeth and headdresses that are serpents, and it's quite painful. He's immiserated. And
Mhm.
he goes, and Apollo says, "Go put yourself on trial in Athens." So he goes, and his defense attorney is Athena, justice. And so she and the prosecuting attorney are these Furies, these ancient goddesses of revenge and vengeance. And so what happens in this trial, what happens as the trial goes on, is Athena convinces them to go from retribution to justice, to
Yeah.
going from immediately this kind of tyranny to the democratic process. She convinces them to become the kindly ones, the enemies of the democratic process,
Mhm.
the enemies of those who bear false witness, the enemies of those who commit injustice. So this is a story that is known, that is brought to us, and we tell it. And this goes back, to what we were saying about, like, Greeks had to sit through this, and after an initiation where their consciousness was expanded, to use the words that people don't say anymore. There was, where are you going to come across a conversation nowadays where people are going to talk about that? Where
Right
they're gonna,
here.
I've mentioned, like, seeing that wired, delusion about we're never gonna have a crash, even though, a few years later, the tech crash is gonna come in a big way.
Mhm.
Well, next to it, I think, there was an article, and I don't remember the publication, but I just remember, throwing the Wired in disgust against the wall and picking up that one, and as synchronicity would have it, there was an article about the long-term effects of LSD. And the people didn't go psychotic. Their children didn't have gills, all of these things that we were told not to do it, not to do acid. The only one thing they have in common is they don't take career seriously. They realize that, they might even have careers, but they don't take it seriously. They're more likely to put it in the terms of archetypal psychology, to follow their daemon, to follow the guiding spirit in their life, and to understand what you were saying about truth and beauty, and the immiseration you feel when. And if you look at the wasteland of our society, built on distraction, built
Yeah.
on a kind of,
And convenience.
yeah, a dark
Convenience and
magicianship,
distraction.
of
Yeah.
being able to take, there's that movie from the 80s, taken from the Bradbury story, Something Wicked This Way Comes.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think
Well,
it's
yeah,
in
what do
the
you want?
October. It's from
Yeah,
what?
what's your wish? What do you want? What's
What
your
is your wish?
wish?
What is it gonna
Yeah.
be, that, Mephistophelian again, but the
Mhm.
immiseration of those nice middle class people that never live by their heart. And go ahead, you look like you were gonna say something.
Alright, so yeah, there's a few things I wanna say. So, if we are not merely separate humans, and we are in fact the, sort of waves of the history of life on Earth and the humans that have come before us and our ancestors and so forth are landing in us right now and being expressed into the world, then when we are capable, and art is, one of these crucial vehicles for this, when we are capable of acts of beauty, acts of justice, and some of those acts are simply speaking something more true than what is commonly on offer, right? Making the nectar of when I say the word justice, I do not mean vengeance. I mean something like resurrection of virtue,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
That's what justice looks like to me, the resurrection of virtue, and not in a puritanical sense, in a relational sense, right? Something so beautiful. It is possible for us, even in this moment, even in our speaking, to do something so beautiful that the entire history of life on this world, like all those beings, they get up and they're like, yeah, that thing. That's what we were talking. That's why we lived and we died, was for that to happen, to become possible, to be enacted by a human being or a cohort of human beings or a group, a living place. The living places are intrinsically heroic. They don't do anything that's not heroic. They can't veer from the path the way humans do, right? We are endowed with this strange position in nature that we can do something that is like we can evacuate the virtue and create a representation and then propagate that. It's vampiric.
Yeah. But I mean, of course, all things come with their opposites. The heroic is going to come with his shadow that makes him fall.
Yes.
There is and so I think, well, okay, we don't have a living lexicon that tells us of the dance between Eros and Psyche.
Oh my God, that might be the most beautiful thing you said all day.
Psyche is the most beautiful woman on the planet, right? According to the story. And she's so beautiful and forth. I mentioned this earlier with Apollo. Well, Aphrodite is upset by this. And she comes to the town she lives in and says, I'm going to destroy the whole place and kill your family unless you sacrifice her to me. So the family, weeping, brings her to the altar, and she's placed on the altar, and there's the sacrificial blade. And the blade goes up in the air, and everybody is weeping and renting their garments. But then all of a sudden, the blade drops, it clanks onto the altar, and Psyche lifts up, and she's carried on a western wind. And she's taken to his palace very much like Cocteau did in Beauty and the Beast,
Mhm.
where everything is taken care of. Her wine glass is empty, um, and a voice appears behind her, and the voice says, "I am your husband. I will give you anything you want, but I ask one thing of you: do not ever look upon me." And he makes an
Mm.
impossible request, of course, of a
Right.
human being, but but so she gets lonely, and she asks, "Okay, I have a request. Can my sisters come visit me?" And like the sisters in fairy tales and myths, the sisters are up to no good.
Right.
The sisters are jealous. They whisper in her ear. They put poison pellets in there. He must be a monster. That's why you can't look at him. He's going to kill you. You know
Right.
how these guys are. He's going to kill you. And so that she's living in fear. The angst has come, and she's laying in bed. And one night she can't take it anymore, and she gets a lamp full of oil and sneaks over to his side of the bed and pulls back the sheets. And there's Eros, the most beautiful entity, the son of Aphrodite, his golden skin, and she shakes, and lamp oil spills on him and mars his beautiful skin. And he weeps and he cries and says, "You, of course, she's a human being. She does the one thing she was asked not to do." And
Right.
he flies away. And Psyche is immiserated after this.
Mhm.
She falls, she's no longer held up by the zephyr. She's on earth, and she becomes gaunt, and she loses her looks. That one function, that one template that we try to use. And she's asking everybody, and she has these little, in certain stories, she has this aspect of where she comes across this little help me, like like Vincent Price in The Fly. She help me, and she looks down, and there's an ant with a golden crown, and he's drowning in a puddle, and she helps him with a twig. And another where an eagle is wounded by an arrow, and she removes him and nurses it. And then she's asking everybody, and then she hears that Eros has returned to his mother's palace, to Aphrodite's house. I don't know if he's in the basement eating hot pockets and playing video games, but he is there, and she supplicates herself at Aphrodite's door. And Aphrodite wants to keep this troublemaker away from her son, this mortal, and says, I'm going to keep her busy. And I alluded to this earlier. She leads her into a room where she has to separate grain from chaff. This is like being led into a room full of cereal, and there's cornflakes, and there's Fruit Loops, and there's Cocoa Crisp. There's every type, and you have to separate it, right?
Mhm.
And so she begins weeping, And what Jung says about this is in this weeping, um, she summons the underworld, the chthonic realms, and the king of the ant, this ant emerges with an army, with this ant with a crown, because she had taken care of the little small things and listened to what other people don't listen to. And they separate the grain from the shade. And so Aphrodite comes back and she's shocked and she has to give her another quest. And this is to go out and make her a fleece from these golden sheep of the sun. And after it's futile, she can't catch them, but she notices when they run through the brambles, once they go, they make it through the thickets and that there's gold strands, and she gathers them and gives them to Aphrodite. So Aphrodite thinks, okay, I have to think of something no mortal can survive. And so she gives her a pail and says, go down to the left, the river of death. Of course, if any mortal goes even close to it, they pass out and they never wake up again. And so Psyche trudges down there and she passes out. But then she feels something lifting her, and it is that eagle.
Mhm.
And he takes the pail and then brings it back to Aphrodite. So Aphrodite has to think of something undoable. Okay, Psyche, I want you to go to the underworld and for Persephone, the queen of the dead, get a locket of immortality. And so along the way, Psyche is telling her tale as she descends, and the shades are weeping. They're all moved by it. She's even moving the dead by everything she's been through, and including Persephone, who gives her the locket. And of course, once again, Pandora comes into it, and she's given an immortal is given this, and she opens it up, and she passes out. But Eros has been watching this, and Eros flies into the world and takes her to Olympus. And the only mortal ever allowed on Olympus and to be enthroned and to be with the gods is Psyche. Um,
It Thank you for that rendition, that's very beautiful. It's reminiscent of stories I've heard in, of all places, Blackfoot culture, which is many thousands of years older than the Greek stuff. And we must imagine that the Greek stuff came from somewhere,
oh, yeah.
right? It didn't just pop up there, right? One of the things that occurred to me while you were speaking, there's this concept of the chorus, right? And
Mhm.
its relation to democracy, the polis, the chorus, um, the democratic approach to, which is very, very different, I think, in its function, in how it worked in Greece than it does
If I can
here.
just add in the story I told
By
earlier
all
about
means.
in the story earlier, the chorus, it would be the jury, because that's also,
Uh-huh.
or the checks and balances in a real democracy, not the one we have now. The
Right.
chorus would be the citizenship that votes that, and so that's what Athena argues to the jury to let essentially Orestia off for killing mom.
Mm,
So there is an aspect of, and I keep using the word aspect. You notice that? Because I'm
sure.
relating my unconscious, my soul is relating to things. Phil, you're only giving part of the story.
Right.
Walt Whitman said, "I contain multitudes."
Yes,
Right?
no, the idea of aspects is fundamental even in, like, internal family systems or psychology
Right,
or
right,
whatever you pick, right? Biology, right? There are aspects,
right.
organs, so to speak, features.
I
And when
keep
we
catching myself saying it. Maybe you can explain it.
Well, I actually had not noticed that you were perhaps overusing the word, but it's a very common word for me as well because, we once again we think like what is we know what something is, really? Well, what if you move your place in the amphitheater? Right? Now you approach it from another angle. Is it still the same thing? What do you
Right.
see then? What is in precedence and what is backgrounding? What is the context? It changes as you orbit. So if we are to become wiser, insightful, we must have at least two or three positions of perspective on something, not one.
Yeah,
This like,
chorus, antagonist, protagonist, as in Greek
yes,
theater. Yes.
yes, yes.
And that's where the fourth thing comes about. That there's a fourth thing that comes about, like the four functions in Jungian psychology. That always there is a quaternity, according to Jung, a transformation that happens by the triad becomes a quaternity. And like, for example, in tarot cards, you get four different functions, the suites of them. You get hearts, for example, cups, pentacles, swords,
Swords.
and there's four of them. And then
Mhm.
it's the interplay between those four aspects, and their different point of view on it. Then that is what's creating, the four elements are also, we're getting these series of fours. And I think that's why I keep catching myself using the word aspect, is I'm
Mm.
coming from an aspect that might be the cups in a tarot card. It might be the four.
I wonder what would happen, and I think there have been experiences of this, and perhaps some ancient cultures were mostly this, in a kind of opposition to ours. If instead of the chorus of the humans, you had the chorus of our souls,
Yeah.
right? What would they sing? What would fill them with joy? What would they inspire? What would they catalyze? What would they want to
Well, that's the
to
secret chord. That's, I
Yes.
mentioned Leonard Cohen's seminal song. That's the secret chord that David played, and it pleads the Lord, right? And that's the thing, is I don't know if we're always in an aspect. Like, let's look at water. Like I mentioned the cups in the tarot.
Mm.
Well, water has all different aspects.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's flowing through as a river, other times it's steam, there's always different ways that water is coming around. There's always a different aspect of water, and these are the aspects of the psyche. And then that chorus you're talking about, okay, the individuals are maybe in a Greek play singing at once, but they're giving a different aspect of the story than protagonist and antagonist and the god. See, then the fourth place would be the gods there,
Mhm.
and the gods that are moving the situation along. So I think it's real important, to see how full of shit we are.
Yeah.
Just to throw, in other words, to say, in other words, to go at any given moment, I am such a good boy with it. I'm trying to relate, but then I have to pause and I have to let Hermes in, you know,
Yes.
and that's where that space, the word liminal is everywhere now. And I
Sure, but as
think,
artists, we know how to get out of our own way. And
yeah,
that's when amazing things happen. And it's not just as artists, even in our conversation today, right? When we get out of our own way, and then there's an invitational space that draws mystery
mhm,
into potential and then expression, right?
right,
And so this is why Darren's not that interesting, right? Yes, of course I'm Darren. Yes, of
yeah,
course I know I want Darren things. Yes, yes.
right, right,
But
yeah,
it's not that interesting. What's interesting, strangely, what's most interesting to me is something you sang about which led to this conversation today. You posted something, wild paraphrase is, I want other brilliant, passionate minds to
right,
be with, to seek with, to learn with, to speak with, to grow with together, right?
yeah,
This was your prayer to the algorithm, quote
yeah,
unquote, right? And that, I have there's a I have a few people that I do this with regularly, as I'm sure you have many. And there's a couple of groups that I do this with regularly. And mostly we get out of our personal way. And what happens is absolutely incredible and unexpectable, right? It's not something any of us could possibly have predicted every time
right,
we get together. And I think in the Agora, this is part of what was going on, right?
right,
They weren't just having arguments, right, about things. They were trying to get above the place where our human desires, histories, urges, failings are become the gods and crush the possibility and the mystery and the beauty and the divinity, right? They're trying to flip that over, right? Which is also what happens in the Eleusinian mysteries. I've recently had the incredible privilege to know Maria Maragou. She's a Greek mystagogue. She initiates people in the mysteries of Eleusina. And what was to hear her speak on this at great length, which is profoundly beautiful. What was going on is this process of sacrificing those human sort of animalistic, if you will, drives and reestablishing uh, what you're going to serve. What are you going to serve? Right? You're going to
Yeah.
serve those drives your whole life? How can you do that as a culture and achieve anything resembling virtue?
Well, I mean, where's the, as this was pointed out by Robert Bly and James Hillman years ago in the men's movement, was that, where does the initiation take place?
Yeah.
In this culture, it certainly doesn't happen in junior high around the time that most cultures do it. You're put into this madhouse, this
That's exactly
asylum.
when it's supposed to happen, right? You're supposed to
Yeah,
our young people grow up expecting in their interiority, right? Not necessarily in their consciousness. They grow up expecting to be invited into the efflorescence of their potential. And what happens? The army?
right. Well,
The
that's one.
corporation?
Well, that's this culture that has a colonialist, empire is going to want to induce young men to be reborn into the realm of Ares, Mars. We are
Mhm.
Rome in a particular way. Like the Greeks, Ares was a minor god. He had his dalliances. James Hillman has a brilliant, frightening book that's very hard to read. It should have been, his only bestseller was The Soul's Code, but it should have been A Terrible Love of War, because the
Ah,
love
yes.
in there was Aphrodite and war was Ares, who are always locked in the lover's bed.
I just want to mention briefly, it just occurred to me that that Arisian uh initiation, right? The love of
Yeah,
war. It all what our corporations are just that sublimated into a less directly violent form. And the
yeah,
violence of those gets absorbed in the torment of living places, nature, ecologies, the biosphere, and so forth, right? We just dump the damage into the silent living membrane around our world,
yeah.
which, maybe circa 1930 or earlier seemed infinite, right? You could just dump as much damage as you want and it'll just keep absorbing it, but certainly is no longer that way modernly.
Yeah, well, yes, we are in runaway right now.
Yeah,
When writing about addiction, Gregory Bateson, a systems theory guy,
I know him.
talks about that. We're in the place. An addict is in the place where the engineer's hand is on the governor's switch and it can't stop. Right? You
Right.
have a governor's
Actually, it
switch
just
on it.
keeps pushing it harder.
Yeah,
Okay. It not just can't stop. If
right.
it was on, if we turned the dial to 10 yesterday, it'll be 100 tomorrow.
Yeah, we're on exponential runaway as far
Yeah.
as that. Just not, it's mirrored in climate change. It is mirrored by these exponential changes that are happening. And so when this happens, when a system goes into runaway like a drunk, the problem is the drunk believes he can control the bottle. I can control this one drink, and he convinces himself of it. This relates to when,
Yeah,
like
but
for
wait,
example,
let me just interrupt you.
yeah,
That the aspect, okay, the thing that you're calling we, first of all, doesn't exist. That's the absence of we that's
right,
doing that shit. And that
yeah.
thing doesn't have feelings or emotions or thoughts or anything. It's just driven like a process drives itself. It's not even a demon. There's nothing. We're like, sorry to get so excited and enthusiastic. I'll lower my voice.
That's fine. I mean, that's to get you going.
It's like a train that the absence of a conductor is what's driving the train, right? And that thing is insatiable. It's like what you said. You quoted someone whose name I can't recall in one of your pieces I read parts of this morning, who said, you can never get enough of what you don't need to be happy.
Eric
Right.
Hoffer.
Yeah, yeah. And that's what's conducting the train, right? It's like,
Yeah.
let's just invent new things that we can never get enough of, that we don't need to be human or intelligent or happy or alive or anything. And that thing, it probably is the closest thing to something that actually resembles evil, but it's not a presence. It's the constant reconcentrating absence of good. It's not even the shadow of the hero, right? It's the absence of both those things.
Well, I get
Or
okay.
it could be
Yeah.
seen that way. It could be
To,
seen
to
that way.
return to Bateson, as far as like this is relieved when the drunk decides the bottle controls me. I don't control the bottle. There's no way I think, what they call, let's say, in recovery is 12 self-will run riot. Is the idea that I have an indomitable character that can overcome this. And but
Really?
see that whatever it is that is driving the trunk that keeps convincing them, like, you're right, it's kind of a zombie consciousness. It worked at one time. And so now in this time of zombie capitalism,
So
it,
there's this problem, which is the humans think that like governments and corporations and things, they treat them as if they're people, right? That they have feelings or ideas or emotions or all of these things that humans have. They got from one perspective that I think is useful. I'm not trying to say what they are, but from one useful perspective, there's nothing in there. It's just lethal processes driving themselves. And I want to be really clear about one other feature. What those motivating functions, they despise life. Life is a threat to their continued dominance and existence. They despise intelligence. They despise creativity. They're like a tyrannical psychotic that wants to evict anything that's a threat to it. And what I mean by a threat to it is a threat to its continued sovereignty over all
well, it's going to
phenomena,
eliminate, it's going to try to kill what it can't control, is and
which is
so, let's
everything.
look at the story of like a trickster myth we're going to look at giantism, giant vehicles on the road, right? Giant McMansions, right? I'm sitting in a house that they're taking the brick faux ranch houses down and putting up McMansions and blocking the sun for the people that do not want a McMansion, right?
Hmm.
And so we have a giantism in our culture. So let's look at Jack and the Beanstalk, just for example. Like we look at this boy who's a fool, and he gets grifted by Hermes, and so, but within that story, though, there is a cow. Let's say it's a mother image that no longer gives milk. There is the land is. It's a Jung pointed out, for example, the giant is eating everything in the psyche. So
Hmm.
everything else, the soul is starving.
Hmm.
So the land now is literally a wasteland. And if we take this out to our culture, there is a giantism that is a like a corporation, and this giantism that becomes a consciousness that is only there, like the giant in Jack and the Beanstalk or these stories. It is only there to survive and to destroy what does not enhance its belief in its survival, even though it's not even alive.
Hmm.
And so what happens when we are dehumanized when we enter that realm? It is stolen the fleeting hours of our finite life to be in that place, and we experience a mortification. Now, in Jack and the Beanstalk, what happens? What is seemingly like, for example, the mythology of Christ being born not in Jerusalem, not in a palace in Rome, being in the sticks where he's not going to be looked for. With, as Jung points out, there's animal shit all around him. You're not going to, the ego is not going to look for this tiny thing like a bean in Jack the Beanstalk. It's not going to look for this in this fool boy. But what happens, as I alluded to Rilke and the sonnets, this beanstalk, which has roots in the ground and it goes up high and it elevates. And there is the golden goose. There is redemption, but it's being hoarded by this giant. The gold of the soul is not being used. The giant doesn't know what to do with it. And then when the slaying of the giant happens, this is where the land is restored. And
Mm.
so if we find ourselves now in this land of giant trucks and giant egos as our president and giantism everywhere, this bloated, unfeeling place that creates alienation, creates dehumanization, I think the crucial work of the soul now, and this is what my daemon tells me I have to do, is I do have to speak about these places, and hence that prayer to the algorithms that you quoted. And and I think as much as we can share these kinds of things and get it out there, and you share to me, and you bring me people, and I bring you people, and
Yes.
then we begin to have this dialogue, that increases, that increases rather than diminishes. Um,
Also, So it's one other thing, right? Those young people that are seeking initiation and they get served something toxic and dead inside instead,
Yeah,
they are very interested in us older people and our ways of learning and seeing and growing together, right? Like that knight, right? Who's retired and he's, I can't ride the horse anymore. I can't go for the grail. I'm gonna
yeah,
have to leave that to future generations. There's knocks on the door. I have out what I would think of as allo children. And these are people, in like their early 20s and stuff. And we just have a blast together and we learn and we grow. And, you know, you, I've watched you. It's so funny that this is our first conversation because I've been watching you for like 15 years, right? And you're an alchemist, man. You're making that medicine, that nectar of insight and something far more deeply resembling truth than what is usually on offer. You're doing that just naturally all day long. You're passionate about it. That reaches into
well,
people's
my wife
hearts.
wants me to do the dishes more, but
Wait, say that again?
my wife wants me to do the dishes more
Yeah,
and
well,
maybe
you
do
should
some
probably
yard work while I'm
I'm not gonna
alchemizing.
argue with her. You should probably do some dishes,
I
Phil.
do. I mean, I
Okay, good.
well, it's then she finds it's something else I've missed, but, so it's like, yeah, what we're talking about is important, and I'm just making light of it because but see, that's the thing, is I remember, like, these experiences, like you said, you got an intuitive idea when you were young that adults were speaking something that was missing the point of all things.
Mhm.
I remember, like, driving in Birmingham, where I was born with my mother, and walking and seeing the poor neighborhoods. And she said, I cried. They called me the judge because I'd look at everything and I was moved to weeping by poverty.
Yeah.
Um,
See, that's
and
the chorus. That's what I'm talking about right there. That's the chorus of our souls that recognizes this should never be. There's no
right,
reason for this to be this way. This is fundamentally wrong. We have
yeah,
to become something better than this together.
yeah.
Today.
Like, I mean,
Even
what
if
I
it's
say, these adults that didn't know,
yeah,
like,
even if it's only in our hearts. For me,
right,
one of the things there were two things where I grew up during the Vietnam War and I saw them on television all the time and I was just
right,
like,
yeah,
what?
yeah,
What? You know? Um, but the other thing was humans seem to think that insects were bad and should mostly just be disposed of.
right,
And the insects were my companions. I adored them, right? They were like gods or angels to me as a young child. I was absolutely enthralled with the existence of all of the tiny life of Earth.
yeah,
So when the adults were like, yeah, you just kill that stuff up.
yeah.
I knew like something's gone wrong in my people. Right?
Yeah.
Like I'm
Oh,
not
yeah,
going
you
to.
have those early communal experiences, like, and you see that there's an insight. I mean, I remember having this terrifying experience. Talk about terror and beauty. Walking through Terminus Station in Birmingham, Alabama, with my parents. I'm about 3.5, 4 years old, and seeing a a life-size Mr. Peanut statue, and this was some insect alien god to me of terror, and running away from it. And dropping down there, you could, as you ran, you saw mica. And I thought the mica was stars and it was God behind it, and praying that it would save me from this thing. And so, the world is alive. These insects are alive. And talking about like what you said, your experiences came to mind about in our apartment complex in Birmingham. There were lots of nice old Southern racist ladies, and they were saying things that were utterly out of their minds and noxious, like, "Well, that Martin Luther King is going to come to town, and all he does is, stir up them bucks." And those bucks, they just want white ladies, and God's against that because you don't see no dog and cat mating, do you? That's why the racists should say. And I'm going, I'm 3.5, 4, 5 years old. I go, lady, those are different species. And they thank you for the sugar cookie, but they're pushing me out the door. Okay, well, I know your mother's Jewish, and you think you're smarter than everybody else. And so it's like,
Right.
this whole this I almost said aspect again, that aspect of life where you as a child know as a child something is intuitively wrong. Yeah, I grew up watching the Vietnam War too, and experiencing a mortification. And that's why, like I said, even when you saw the way hippies were being mocked on the television at the time, where they never got beatniks, which beatnik isn't even a word that, a beat ever uttered. It was like a journalist in San Francisco, I believe. Jack
Mm.
Kerouac is so out in space, he's like Sputnik. He's a beatnik, right? That's where the word beatnik came from.
Wow.
So, so the aspect of where the beats, how they were noxiously limbed, how the hippies were noxiously, that's what most people knew. I remember sitting around with people that never watched anything from television. And when you talk to them about the 60s, they talk about that time. I Dream of Jeannie and the hippies came in, right?
Mm.
That was what it was to them, not this organic. And you talk about the compensation for the corporate culture, for the war machine culture, or this all of a sudden what came about. And there was a problem with the flower people because the flower people, are going to be a little bit green, as um, um, Robert Bly talking about the Beatles, for example. John Lennon staying in the bathroom because of his mother was dead, right? So the flowers came up from the earth. And as the men's movement came about, okay, how are men that came up like this? How are we going to live in the world? We're going to be green. What is going to be our grail? And that's the other aspect. That's the compensation coming up. But the compensation was necessary in the 60s.
Mm.
We needed the white goddess to rise and inspire the Beatles because what we were getting was the war machine and this hyper masculine culture. I mean, my father was in the airborne, and he walked around like he thought he was Kirk Douglas, right? He would explode and rage like the men of those times. Kirk would just explode, and it was like that. Those were the men we were confronted with. This very volatile, war was the answer. And even though my father was cool, he still had that aspect. And so all these really nice people now that are afraid of the patriarchy, they're an overcompensation for
Mhm.
these out of hand over. And so this is where the alchemy comes together. This is where, you were talking about reaching out to young people. They need to be taught. My generation needs to be taught to be a little nicer. Huxley at the end of his life are going, what's the answer? As he's giving his college lectures and he's saying, just try to be a little nicer to each other. Well, this prophecy came too true with a lot of young people now.
Yeah,
We're
right.
ultra nice, and they need a little bit of that. They need a little bit of Burroughs crustiness.
Mm.
They need a little bit more of that Kirk Douglas in them to
Mm.
confront power. And as I wrote about the article I put up on Substack today, um, was that in the idea of where how do we convince? You're not going to be able to convince unreasonable power. You're not going to be able to go into the
No,
corporate boardrooms.
that's
You're
the
not
wrong
going to
that's the
go into
wrong
government.
strategy, generally speaking.
Right? They're not going to respond to logic. We
No.
can have all these well-reasoned arguments about what they're doing is bad for the earth and even bad for themselves. But at the same
Useless.
time, what is going to be that Orphic influence that begins to make the transformation? And once again, I think this is where the hippies were right. It's going to come out, and in some way, we have to reinvent culture. And practically the last thing that I heard James Hillman say at his 80th birthday celebration in Pittsburgh, um, as at the formal talks ended, um, he said, "Keep the conversation going."
Yeah.
That's what, and, later then he read William Butler Yeats's Sailing to Byzantium because he was 80, there's no country for old men. But the last thing he said in the formal talk was, we have to have a dialogue about this. And somehow we have to keep, there's a hermetic place where there is an insularity and there is where the transformation is happening. But at some point, though, after the process of the blackening is happening, then the opening up and bringing in younger people. My favorite movie critic, the best movie critic that ever wrote and entertaining was Pauline Kael in The New Yorker. And
Mm.
she wouldn't go to the movie with geezers like me. I have my fixed opinion about what they would be. She would, see the young people who are writing in the Village Voice, and she, the younger people, and she'd invite them. And that's who she'd go to the movie because afterwards she could have coffee with him and have a discussion with people without ossified opinions.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, you don't wanna, ply around with fossils. There's a couple of things,
Right.
though, that I think are important. You know, we've been inculcated with this idea that you gotta fight the things that are wrong. I think that rarely works out well. Most of the things that are problematical are highly structured, profoundly historically momentous, right? They have this incredible momentum behind them. And, if you go at them face on, bad things are likely to happen or just failure.
Well, that's a point where you're going to have the Red Army face the Nazis, right? Okay, that extremist has happened where this juggernaut of Nazism has happened, but that's the extremist of life. Thank God, on most days we're not faced with that, and that's why we're unprepared to deal with climate change. Because on most days, blissfully little has happened. I have a poem, and it's talking, and everything in the poem, like an old sofa is yearning to be a luxury bed in a luxury hotel, and the luxury hotel is yearning to be a flop house with a poet, that's writing unpublishable verse, and everything in it is transforming. And it gets to the point where, there's an aspect, an individual that it's longing to be a garment on a prostitute that's given to her, that gives to a soldier that goes to a war and dies. And the war is longing to be a quiet evening at home. And so,
Wow.
there's this always this longing. And this is where it's really important to say, sometimes we fight the power. Sometimes we yield. Sometimes we're like Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee, we're like water, but what type of water, right?
Mm.
Yeah. Sometimes we're like fire
Yeah. Oh,
and
I
water,
agree.
right?
No,
Yeah.
it's as if there certainly isn't one answer, but one of the things that I've come to understand in my own concerns about our situation and possibilities for transformation is that, talking to people rarely does much good. What humans seem to respond to and need and what actually creates change is giving people something to do, someone to be, something to become. And this is what has been largely captured by our toxic culture and the other toxic cultures of modernity. They've got a sort of stranglehold on role, and humans ache for meaningful roles. If you can give them, even in a playful way, an experiment, an adventure, something to become together, this tends to work very quickly. I suspect that one of the keys to the problems we face is to reverse that empty we, right? That we keep using, right? Well, we can't we're not going to be able to do anything about climate change. We can't stop nuclear. There's no we there yet. What if we weified so that there was something
Well, there was a
resembling.
we that, an anti-nuke movement that Trump and others have reversed. The
Right.
Democrats starting a war in Ukraine. There was a we at one time that did have an effective anti-nuclear movement,
Yeah.
that caused Ronald Reagan to go to Reykjavik. And
Yeah, I
there
would
are
say, yeah, there
consequences,
were organs of a we. Yeah, there were
right?
organs of
And
we-ness.
the thing about it, one caveat, conversation. And I'm not talking about debate. I mean, though we can have a debate in the agora, conversation is eros,
Oh,
and
agreed.
eros is entering the psyche, like the story I told. Eros,
Yes.
and so you're having this dance between eros and psyche in good conversations.
Yes.
I am, that's why I'm saying keep the conversation going, and and this is not to intimidate people. They don't have to make their conversation art. Let's just try our best to make them artful. In other
Yeah.
words, and the way you do that, and I think the word authentic is overused. It's overused by people that are purists. But what I mean, when I'm going to use the word authentic is, I used the word daemon before. That what
Mhm.
is the force of character of where you've done the soul work and you're allowing yourself to speak from the polis of yourself.
Yes.
You are, there is,
The
you
chorus
know,
too.
yeah, the chorus and all those other kinds of things. You're listening to yourself and you're listening to the other people. And then, whatever the forces are gathering around, and that they are giving. I know when I've collaborated with people, all of a sudden I'm speaking lines, and those, I don't know where those lines are coming from, but they're
Yes.
best lines in the poem or the comedy routine, and that can only happen by the experience of, the music is playing and there are other people dancing and you join in.
Yes, yes. So this is I just want to say so there's this thing we can do together where we establish a third mind, right?
Yep.
It's not my mind, it's not your mind, right? It's this space that we fertilize and rise up into out of ourselves.
Well,
And
yeah.
one
One
of
of
the
the books of quantum physics I've read, I can't remember which one it was, and it talks about a group of people that set out to create a conscious entity. And a creature like a poltergeist, and I believe its name was Philip, came about, and Philip actually existed with this group of people, that they had created an entity that communicated to them.
See, this is part of what I'm trying to get at when I say whatever we are, I think the smallest part of what we are is human. And even in our humanity, even in that, the part that we inhabit is like about this much of it, right? It's like the tip of the pinky of an entire organism, and we're mostly trapped in there. We have no idea what we are because we don't live, most of us, and we don't adventure into and create and invent together the context in which we could understand what it
Well, you
means.
used the word pinky, and then earlier we were talking about the hand. You were bringing
Yes,
up,
it was on
you know,
purpose. Yeah.
yeah. So the hand extends, and then what is that hand? And I think that there is a very strong part of, and you were mentioning this before, very strong part of whatever this ecosystem of souls is. Whatever it is, it wants us to have a human experience.
Yes,
And
yes, I
that's a
agree.
very crucial part in some small way, the same way a liver has its function, the same way a
Yes,
heart has it.
absolutely. And
And
it's divine and inspired. It's not merely pragmatic.
right, no, yes, it's not pragmatic. I think it's there to, I remember Terence McKenna speaking of the Fabergé eggs, of the making of the Fabergé eggs by the machine elves. And he was saying when he finally was able to construct one, this joy went out through the universe, right?
Yeah.
This excitement happened when he made his own little version of those cosmic Fabergé eggs. And in Pan's Labyrinth, when the young girl sacrifices herself for the greater good, this applause goes out among the heavens. There is this, and I've had dreams of those arenas where there are these watchers that
Yeah.
are there. And when we make something like what happened with McKenna, it makes them happy. And it is not, like you said, it's not crackpot realism. They're doing it because joy is their nutrition.
I'm not here for Darren, but I'm mostly here for other beings.
Yeah,
Right? And so just recognizing that by itself is both humbling and profoundly empowering because it invites the chorus and the Paulus and the protagonist and the antagonist and the audience, and
right.
the jury and whatever, right? It invites all of that into expressivity and potential in the conversation, in my relationships, and in acts of both creative wonder or play, but also like things that are intrinsically heroic: rescue, love, adoration, care, um, helping a being who, when Psyche rescued the Ant King, right,
Yeah.
or pulled
A
the arrow
small
from.
thing that we ignore. Yes.
Yeah, right.
The small
This
part
is
that the
what.
ego doesn't want to recognize, because I got an agenda right now, and I'm feeling sorry for myself because I'm no longer beautiful, and I've got to go get my husband back, but she takes the time to
Yeah.
hear this king of the ants and rescues it. And that's the thing that,
Transforming her identity, the meaning of the earth, the meaning
yeah,
of the sky, right? This kind of act, it changes what everything is. It's ontologically transformative. It these sorts of acts of the great beauty of the heart and of the sort of the chorus of of the souls, they change what reality means.
yeah,
It
and
might
we are the
still
vehicle, yes,
look
yeah.
it might
Yeah.
still look the same as it did a moment ago, but it is no longer that way.
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, we're seeing it with new eyes, we're coming upon a reality that is, more of a it's more of this transmogrifying landscape that we're trying to make sense of by seeing particulars. And I think analogous to what we think is our individuality, cellular structure, right? This cell all of a sudden describing itself as an individual. Well, it is an individual cell, but it's working within this corpus. And then we even get into what the microtubules are up to, right?
Sure.
That they seem to be that function you're talking about, that the microtubules are, just devouring their amino acids and having something to do with consciousness that we don't understand. You know,
Yeah,
that,
I mean,
that
I love Penrose's take on this. It's much more sophisticated than it
yeah,
appears superficially. I've
yeah,
paid close attention to his work. You know, we should probably wrap up fairly soon, but I have a couple more things I'd like to chase with you if you got a few
yeah.
more minutes. One of them is how did you come onto the work of Pasulka? Was it through uh oh gosh, what's his name? You mentioned him earlier at Rice University.
Jeffrey Kripal.
Kripal. Yeah, was it through him or how did you come across her?
Just one of those serendipities, somebody, algorithms can actually help with that, right?
Sure.
And you're coming about and maybe something catches your eye. Like I'm just trying to do some research about what my son and I saw. So I'm, looking at I'm going online, I'm searching for Jacques Vallée. And, so Jacques Vallée's um, experience with you, when you have high strangeness like that. And then you'll just see, Dianthus, her mentioned, and I'm going to go see who this is. Right.
Okay, slow
And
down. Just
yeah,
slow down for a moment. I wanna direct you a little bit if you'll allow me.
yeah.
Um, so first of all, like, I have some connections with this whole thing, right?
Okay.
I know Valet. I've read Pasulka.
Right.
Um, we got Christmas cards from Valet here last year and stuff, right? He lives here in San Francisco. And I've followed his work for many years, and I've been interested in, UFOs since I was a child. I probably, read, Chariots of the Gods when I was, like, 7 or whatever. What did you and your son see? What happened? Tell me the story.
Okay. Well, I think we're crossing the street, not too busy. It's in this
Oh, that story.
that story of, and so, we're crossing the street and that high strangeness happened
Mhm,
about what that vehicle was, where obviously was not operating by the laws of physics. It had no tires, there was no propulsion device. It, we both saw it disappear into thin air. We felt its presence behind us, both of us.
mhm,
If there was something there, he saw something, a slight variation of what I saw.
mhm.
So, what popped out of a dimension, out of a portal. Like my son has been fascinated with portals since I used to tell him, when he's 4 or 5 years old, I would tell him stories, and I always had to have a portal to another dimension.
Right, right.
so, so there was, whatever it was, whatever that was that came and went for whatever reason of its own. I think that's when I went and I said, okay, what does Valet say about this? And and so I started investigating, his concept of high strangeness. And that probably, I can't remember exactly, led to the writing of Diane, which when I came across her books, I said, okay, I know, spoke to my wife, what a couple of books I want for Christmas, right?
Mhm.
So, I ordered her books. And so it was, that as, and so I found that extreme, I found it riveting, that you have experiences in your life, and sometimes they can come about through an elephant dream, or
Yes.
sometimes they can come upon a visionary experience,
Yes.
that Kripal's flip happens,
Mhm.
and so
I
and
mean,
they
other
they
things
still
happen.
periodic.
Sorry.
Like I can tell you experience of how I came across James Hillman. Of two books came into my hand. I was giving a talk on Hermes, and I saw a book. It was in the passage of Hermes where Hermes is helping Odysseus with the problem of Circe. So I just came across a book that said Hermes and synchronicity, and I'm pulling it from the shelf, and another book called Loose Ends falls into literally falls into my hands. And I said, okay, I'll look at the second. I open up the book about Hermes and synchronicities, and it's talking about something called library angels that show up at a crucial time, and the right book ends up in your hands. And
Mm.
behind me, these two women, I overhear them talking. One of them saying, she's saying, up the street at the Far Road Library yesterday, I was looking for this story that you told me about by Oscar Wilde. And I couldn't find it anywhere. It wasn't on the shelf in the Wilde section where his other books were. But then I see somebody get up and they just leave a book and they walk abruptly out of the library. And I have to check. I go over checking the book, and it's the Oscar Wilde book and the story you were telling me about. And I'm overhearing these women say that, and I'm going, look, the library angels, you saw a library, and they're backing away from me slowly because it was not their experience to hear that tale, but it was so. But and then I opened up the book, and it was when my first marriage ended, and there had been a betrayal involved, and there was betrayal in this group of the Odyssey. There were betrayals happening in it, and this whole thing was living out. And James Hillman's essay in Loose Ends about Odysseus and the coming to manhood by betrayal is and I actually said to him, and he said, I said, okay. He goes, I know what story you're going to tell me when I was speaking to him. He said, I know it's this thing from Loose Ends. He said, that sort of came out of me in a period of betrayal when I was a very young man. It just sort of showed up, and I wrote it practically overnight. So it was like in the story, and like, okay, the opening of the story would sound anti-Semitic, but as I said, I'm half Jewish, so if so, half of my mother's people would be so it starts off with a Jewish father, and he sets his son on a mantle, and he says, "Son, jump to me," and the boy jumps, and the father moves out of the way, and the kid flatters on the ground and cries, and the father says, "Let that be a lesson to you. Never trust a Jew or a father." And so so Kilman gets into explaining himself about this. Okay, um, he says that when we men reach a certain age, and this has to be with the initiation work he later did with Robert Bly. Eden is mom. It's the garden. Like your mother's breast or the food mom brings to you, and is going to show up there on your tray. And but then God shows up, everyone, and Eden ends. In other words, in
Mm.
Jungian psychology, the mother is the image, and then with the Greeks, you go out into Zeus, and Zeus is the cosmos,
Mhm.
and he contains all the other gods. So Hillman was saying in these initiation books he was writing and working with Bly about it and having these men's meetings that where in our culture, the men that came of age in the 60s were not having this initiation period. So betrayal is the wound of Odysseus. Odysseus, he compares in the essay the Caledonian boar that kills Adonis. Adonis lives with mom, Aphrodite. She buries him half the year, and he spends it with Persephone. So, but he is killed by the Caledonian boar. That's what kills Adonis. But Odysseus also has this wound in the same place, and that is what's when he's washed up on Ithaca. That's what's recognized by his nurse as that he is the returned king because he lived through that wounding, which is the leaving of the Edenic realm. But what Odysseus needed, though, was all these shipwrecks to have confrontation with goddesses because he was a Greek patriarch and he was so wily he couldn't be taught. But till he was set down and made miserable and lost everything, he was still not quite a man. And so it's the betrayals that Hillman is saying that when you live, that you want unconditional love, but when you realize love is conditional, real love breaks out. And it's the same thing that happened to Psyche when she fell to earth. Um,
It's part of the process of maturation, even though
right,
that word is, value laden in ways that I don't mean. Uh,
right.
I mean, like, developmental efflorescence, right? And the phases of that efflorescence.
Well,
Um,
Hillman calls it try to stay in naivety, and this culture has it. It's this obsession of the innocence, and he calls that toxic innocence, right?
mm,
But there is an aspect of innocence we return to in the Blakean sense that's completely, that's different from toxic innocence. that this rebirth of wonder, as Ferlinghetti put it, I am looking for the rebirth of wonder in his Coney Island of the mind, that there
Mm.
is that is Blakean innocence. Blake was a major influence on the beat writers. But
Mhm.
the toxic innocence of where, let's say, I'm walking down the street and I'm staying at my sister's house when we first came to America, and this very nice but insane bourgeois woman is talking to me, and she's going, "In that house, there's a pedophile, and it's this abandoned house, and there's nobody living there." So I asked my sister about it later, and it turns out there was this old man. He was lost, and he asked a cop who was an undercover cop for directions, and they were doing a dragnet for prostitutes, for men, for Johns. So he
Mm.
gets on these lists that these moms see on computers, and they have this, they have the hysteria of Hestia about protection, and so that's toxic innocence.
Mm.
That the idea that we blindly, Hestia's in her house, and every time Priapapus, who's a funny little god, who's a god of sense of humor, he's mostly phallus. If you're still in Italy, you see these you see these little statues, these huge phalluses in the yard. Well, that's Priapapus. He is the crude joke. But every time he tries to enter the house, donkey brays and Hestia passes out. So
Mm.
it's this. So where this comes into in this vast dialogue of things of what Hillman's getting at is when innocence is lost, um, the soul making starts to show up. Because if you're in Eden, you are locked in childhood. And in some ways, our culture is very emotionally arrested that way.
Mhm.
That the woundings don't happen of life. And I'm not saying sadomasochism, I'm not talking about hurting people for the sake of hurting people. I'm talking about the soul making that Yeats is talking about, by seeing the terrible beauty of the world. That's going to create a wound in you. When I'm having these wounding experiences, I'm walking home in Alabama and I'm jumped by rednecks, right? That is, which actually would happen, right? A Jewish boy walking home, and there's a wounding that happened to me there, or where the teacher sends me and another little girl out of the room, and that was the day they talked about that aspect of the New Testament. I believe it's in Matthew where the Jew killers killed our Lord, right? And I'm jumped on the playground. There's an aspect of where I'm learning a little bit more about what's out there. And later after my hippie days and all of that, I'm in high school and getting jumped again, and I take karate and I get a black belt, and that's an initiation into another life, but it's a little bit limited. There's just way too much Aries, and a lot of men in there that are gay and they're hiding it by hypermachoism, but they're not going to come to they're not going to come into an awareness of embracing the Spartan aspect of being gay. They are going to keep saying, making these weird projections that kicking and punching and doing this life is going to drive the gay out of them. So, and then I just have to go into the initiation of I'm walking around my neighborhood with a ukulele and I want some money and I'm chanting my poems, because if you're walking around with a musical instrument, you're not panhandling. And if you're being yourself and saying funny and speaking poetry, I'm going to say, yeah, I'm going to give you a poem for a quarter. And I have enough for lunch at the local Zestos, right? So there's an aspect of how these woundings, the madness that I could not live an ordinary life, um, that wounding of the way I'm humiliated when I try to do something that, like it's when I'm trying to have a normal, ordinary life working. It's like those scenes in I Love Lucy where she's in the chocolate factory. There's just, something goes askew to take me back so I'm a troubadour on the streets.
Mm.
That's the way it's going to work out. And a way, those are the woundings I'm talking about, the humiliations that happen that when you're not living the life you're supposed to live. And the world wounds you so the wound can become a wound.
Mm.
And in that process that's the wounding that Hillman's talking about when you lose your innocence.
Beautiful.
Well, this is when Greeks say that silence happens, that's when Hermes enters. When there's a conversation going, and suddenly everything is quiet.
Sometimes we have to make space
Yeah.
for that. Phil, I'm so grateful to have this time with you right now. I hope we may have future conversations if
I
you're
hope
open to
so.
that. I
Yeah,
would very
we
much.
should carve a group of people like
Yeah.
this group we're connected with, and we should, and that way we can enrich, enlarge, deepen, and expand ourselves, go outward and upward and down at the same time. I have
Yes, yes,
a
we
number
have,
of people do it.
there's actually a couple of groups. I've just started a new one, but we have this thing called the Organon, which is going on Saturdays around 12 p.m. PST. So that would be like 4 p.m. your time.
Okay,
And I'll send you an invitation, but I would love to have a further conversation where we can explore some other features of our history, thought, creativity, and so forth, just together. If you're open to that.
sure. Yeah, all in any of those. Yes.
Excellent.
All right.
Um, Thank you, my friend.
Yeah.
Fabulous to spend this time with you today. I'm so happy and grateful that we could explore together and perhaps experience a kind of anamnesis, if I may use the Greek
Okay.
word.
All right. Bye bye.
Peace for now.
All
More
right.
soon.